before the world was engulfed in fire, before oceans turned red and steel ships sank beneath the Pacific, there was peace, fragile, deceptive, and fleeting. In the early years of the 20th century, two great powers stood on opposite sides of an ocean, watching each other, measuring strength, and preparing for a storm no one could yet name. Japan, an island empire reborn in ambition, forged by modernization, and driven by destiny. America, vast, industrial, confident, yet untested in the crucible of modern war. Between them lay the Pacific, a boundless expanse that would soon become history's greatest naval battlefield. Before the world was engulfed in fire, before oceans turned red and steel ships sank beneath the Pacific, there was peace, fragile, deceptive, and fleeting. In the early years of the 20th century, two great powers stood on opposite sides of an ocean, watching each other, measuring strength, and preparing for a storm no one could yet name. Japan, an island empire reborn in ambition, forged by modernization, and driven by destiny. America, vast, industrial, confident, yet untested in the crucible of modern war. Between them lay the Pacific, a boundless expanse that would soon become history's greatest naval battlefield. For Japan, the 1930s were years of transformation, a nation of samurai discipline and imperial hunger. The emperor's armies marched through China. Their fleet, sleek, modern, and formidable, stretched from the Sea of Japan to the South Pacific. To the Japanese Navy, the ocean was not a barrier, it was a promise. And in Tokyo, a new generation of admirals believed they could challenge the greatest industrial power on Earth and win. But Japan's rise came with a shadow, one cast by oil, steel, and pride. When the United States, alarmed by Japan's aggression in China, cut off vital exports, especially oil, Tokyo faced a terrifying choice: surrender its ambitions or seize the resources it needed by force. They chose war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the calm waters of Pearl Harbor mirrored a sky that held no warning. American sailors woke to another tropical Sunday. Some prepared for church. Others polished brass on the decks of ships that had never seen battle. Then, the world changed in 90 minutes. At 7:55 a.m., Japan struck. Waves of aircraft, painted with the red sun of the rising empire, dove from the clouds. Torpedoes streaked across the harbor. Bombs fell with surgical precision. Battleships, the pride of the American fleet, were torn open like paper. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California. Within minutes, over 2,000 Americans lay dead. Pearl Harbor was more than a surprise attack. It was a declaration, the beginning of a new world order written in fire. The Japanese believed America would recoil, negotiate, perhaps even accept a divided Pacific. They were wrong. The sleeping giant had been awakened. Across the United States, steel plants roared, aircraft rolled off assembly lines, and men and women rushed to enlist. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned his own government. "I feel all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. Yet even as smoke rose from Pearl Harbor, Japan's high command looked beyond victory. They needed to secure their empire, quickly, before America could strike back. Their strategy was elegant and dangerous. Strike south for oil and resources. Fortify the Pacific. Then lure the remaining American fleet into a decisive battle, one that would annihilate U.S. naval power for a generation. That dream, the decisive battle doctrine, would drive Japan's every move in the months to come. Within weeks, Japan swept through Southeast Asia like wildfire. Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Each victory fed the illusion of invincibility. Each triumph pushed their empire closer to overreach. Meanwhile, in the vast Pacific, a single American aircraft carrier force remained, small, battered, but dangerous. At its helm, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a quiet man with steel resolve. Nimitz took command of the shattered Pacific Fleet amid chaos. Half his ships lay on the harbor floor. His sailors were green. His aircraft were outdated. But his spirit, and that of the American Navy, was unbroken. He knew the war would be decided not by battleships, but by aircraft carriers. And in that belief lay the seed of Japan's destruction. While Japan expanded, a small group of men in a secret building in Hawaii began fighting a different kind of battle, one waged in silence, numbers, and code. They were the cryptanalysts of Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Their mission: break Japan's naval codes. They didn't know it yet, but their work would decide the fate of nations. Early 1942 was a time of chaos and defiance. American bombers struck Tokyo in a daring raid led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. A symbolic strike, but a vital one. In May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American and Japanese carriers clashed in history's first battle fought entirely by aircraft. The Japanese won on paper, but they lost something far more valuable: time, planes, and experience. It was the beginning of the turning tide. Now, Yamamoto turned his eyes toward the next step, the final blow that would destroy the American fleet. His target, a small, obscure atoll in the middle of the Pacific, called Midway. The Japanese believed they would catch the Americans by surprise. They had no idea their every move was being read, intercepted, decoded, and anticipated. As the sun set on the first half of 1942, two great fleets moved toward destiny. Japan, confident, unstoppable. America, battered, but ready. They would meet at Midway, and in 3 days of fire and courage, the course of the entire war would change. This is the story of that battle, and of the men, machines, and decisions that turned the Pacific from a Japanese lake into the graveyard of an empire. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific was a chessboard, every move measured, every piece costly. Japan stood triumphant, her empire stretching farther than ever in history. From the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the rising sun flew high. But beneath that banner of victory, a quiet battle was being fought, not with guns or torpedoes, but with pencils, typewriters, and codebooks. It was a battle Japan didn't even know it was losing. Station HYPO, a dimly lit building tucked inside Pearl Harbor's naval yard. Inside, a handful of officers and linguists were piecing together fragments of Japanese radio transmissions. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, eccentric, brilliant, and utterly obsessed. He and his team worked in near isolation. Their mission, to crack Japan's naval cipher, known as JN-25, a code so complex it contained over 30,000 possible combinations for each message. The Japanese believed it unbreakable. Rochefort believed otherwise. Every intercepted signal, every fragment of a phrase, was a clue. AF preparing fresh water. Convoy leaving truck. Strike force assembling. Bits and pieces, meaningless alone. But to Rochefort, they painted a pattern pointing toward a single target, a place the Japanese called AF. The question was, what was AF? It appeared again and again in coded orders, a focal point for something big. Washington believed it might be the Aleutian Islands. Others guessed Hawaii, or perhaps Fiji. Rochefort and his team had another theory, one that would change history. They believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny ring of coral halfway between Hawaii and Japan. An American outpost barely visible on a map, yet strategically priceless. If Japan took Midway, Hawaii could be next, and America's Pacific Fleet would be split in two. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz listened carefully to Rochefort's theory. He was a cautious man, a submariner by training, with a calm mind under pressure. If Rochefort was right, the Japanese were planning to strike Midway soon. If he was wrong, Nimitz would risk the last of America's carrier fleet on a phantom threat. The weight of the Pacific rested on a guess. To prove it, Rochefort devised a ruse. He instructed Midway's garrison to send an unencrypted radio message claiming their water purification plant had broken down. Hours later, Japanese intelligence reported that AF is short on fresh water. The trap worked. AF was Midway. The hunters had become the hunted. Meanwhile, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was crafting the grand design for his decisive battle. His plan, Operation MI. It would unfold with mathematical precision. A diversionary attack on the Aleutians to draw American attention north. A massive carrier strike on Midway to lure out the U.S. fleet. Then a crushing ambush that would annihilate the lost American carriers. Yamamoto believed his enemy was demoralized, broken, predictable. He had no idea that his own communications were being read, line by line. Japan's admirals reviewed the plan with confidence. 4 of their most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, SRY, and Hiryu, would form the core of the strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Supporting them, 2 battleships, 15 escorts, a dozen cruisers, and over 250 aircraft, the most formidable naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific. The Imperial Navy was ready to end America's resistance in one glorious stroke. Nimitz, now armed with Rochefort's intelligence, prepared his defense. He had only 3 carriers available: USS Enterprise, commanded by Raymond Spruance; USS Hornet, under Mark Mitchell; and USS Yorktown, badly damaged from the Coral Sea. Yorktown was supposed to be out of action for months. Nimitz gave her 3 days. Hundreds of dock workers swarmed over the ship, repairing bomb damage, welding plates, replacing cables. They worked around the clock. In just 72 hours, Yorktown, patched, scarred, but seaworthy, left Pearl Harbor once again to face Japan. On May 28, 1942, Nimitz summoned his carrier captains. The plan was simple and deadly. They would wait northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range. When Nagumo's carriers struck the island, the Americans would pounce. For once, the U.S. Navy would know exactly where the enemy would be, and when. The calm before the storm. On the morning of June 3, 1942, lookouts on Midway spotted aircraft on the horizon, Japanese long-range scouts. The enemy was coming. Midway's defenses roared to life. Marine aviators scrambled their fighters. Coastal guns aimed skyward. As the sun rose, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot sighted the atoll and radioed back the message Yamamoto had been waiting for. Enemy base located. Commencing attack. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of Akagi, confident. The battle was unfolding exactly as planned. His strike aircraft, over 100 bombers and fighters, launched from the decks, engines howling, rising into the blue Pacific sky. Their target, Midway. At that moment, Nagumo believed his enemy was far away. In truth, 3 American carriers were already in position, waiting. From the decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, pilots waited in their ready rooms. Maps were marked. Fuel checks made. They knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew something the Japanese didn't. Thanks to the codebreakers of Station HYPO, the Americans weren't reacting, they were ambushing. The stage was set. 2 mighty fleets, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, each blind to the other's exact position. One confident in its invincibility, the other desperate, yet armed with knowledge worth more than any weapon. Within hours, they would meet. And in that meeting, history would pivot. The codebreakers had done their part. Now, the fate of the Pacific would rest in the hands of young pilots, barely out of training, who would fly into the heart of the Japanese armada armed with little more than courage and the element of surprise. The next dawn would see chaos, fire, and death, and the birth of a legend. The morning of June 4th broke with deceptive calm. The Pacific stretched endlessly, blue and silent, concealing 2 fleets poised for destruction. Above Midway Atoll, Japanese reconnaissance planes scanned the horizon. Their mission was simple: locate the American carriers and report back. Simple, yet fatefully flawed. Because hidden beyond their range, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were lying in wait. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese would strike. This knowledge would be their greatest weapon. On the decks of the Enterprise, pilots checked instruments and strapped into their cockpits. Planes roared to life: F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Each aircraft carried more than ordnance. It carried the hopes of a fleet and a nation. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron briefed his squadron. Remember your training. Stick to the plan. Watch each other's backs. And above all, survive to tell the story. The young men nodded, adrenaline coursing. None could know that by the end of the day, heroism and tragedy would be inseparably intertwined. On the Japanese side, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo coordinated his strike. From Akagi, Kaga, SRY, and Hiryu, over 100 aircraft were prepared to unleash destruction on Midway. Nagumo believed he was executing a flawless plan. He could not foresee that intelligence, patience, and chance had already tilted the scales. At 5:30 a.m., Japanese aircraft lifted off in precise waves. Dive bombers and torpedo planes angled into the sky, engines screaming, bombs and torpedoes secured beneath the fuselage. Below, Midway's garrison braced. Marines scrambled to their positions. Coastal guns swung toward the rising sun. Every second was measured. Every moment mattered. The first torpedo bombers reached Midway just after dawn. The defenders' fighters swarmed, desperate to intercept. Hundreds of planes collided in a deadly ballet above the coral atoll. Explosions tore across the air and sea. Ships shuddered. Craters blossomed across runways. It was chaos, the beginning of a battle that would decide the Pacific's fate. From Yorktown, repaired against all odds, torpedo and dive bomber squadrons launched. Their orders were clear: find the Japanese carriers and strike. The crews knew the odds were grim. TBD devastators, slow and lightly armored, would face Japanese Zeros in open sky. Yet courage outweighed fear. In the minds of these young men, victory was not guaranteed. Survival was a hope, a prayer whispered over the roar of engines. Above the Japanese fleet, Zeros intercepted American planes. Fierce dogfights erupted. Wings sliced through sunlight. Trace of fire arced across the sky. For every American plane that fell, another pressed on, diving toward the heart of the enemy formation. It was a test of nerves, skill, and fate, one in which split-second decisions would alter the course of history. As the sun climbed higher, the first waves of Americans closed in. The Japanese carriers were unaware that their lives, their ships, and the destiny of their empire hung by a thread. In the next minutes, dive bombers would plunge, torpedoes would streak across the water, and the Pacific would witness a clash unlike any before it. The first American planes approached the Japanese fleet, silhouetted against the rising sun. The sea below gleamed deceptively calm, hiding the steel leviathans poised for destruction. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his torpedo bombers toward the enemy. Slow, exposed, and lightly armored, the TBD devastators cut through the air like fragile arrows aimed at an unyielding wall. Every second mattered. Every maneuver could mean survival or death. On the Japanese carriers, alarms screamed, and crews scrambled to launch defensive aircraft. The fabled Mitsubishi Zeros took to the air, the engines screaming like banshees, determined to meet the American attackers head-on. From above, the devastators looked small, insignificant, almost like insects swarming toward a raging flame. Yet in their engines, guns, and bombs was the determination of a nation's hope. The torpedo squadrons dove. Japanese fighters swarmed. The sea erupted beneath them, anti-aircraft fire shredding the morning air. Planes fell in spirals of fire, plunging into the ocean. Others barely escaped to circle for another attack. Losses were catastrophic. Yet, the attack had a hidden purpose. Though many devastators would not survive, their assault forced Nagumo's fighters to climb, leaving the deck vulnerable. It was a deadly gamble, one that would soon tip the scales. From Enterprise, dive bombers prepared their attack. Their orders: wait for altitude, dive steep, release bombs with precision, and strike the carriers below. As the devastators drew the enemy's attention, the dauntless pilots climbed, unseen, approaching from a different angle. In the chaos, they were ghosts, invisible harbingers of destruction. Back at Midway, radar operators and codebreakers tracked Japanese movements. The reports reached Nimitz and Spruance. The Americans had confirmed the enemy's location. The strike was aligned, timing perfect. The moment of reckoning was near. Above the horizon, the first dive bombers began their deadly arcs. Nagumo's decision hours earlier, to rearm planes for a second strike against Midway, proved fateful. Decks crowded with bombs and torpedoes became tinder. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would decide the Pacific. At 10,000 feet, the SBD Dauntless pilots spotted their targets. The carriers below gleamed in the morning sun, steel decks crowded with planes, sailors moving frantically, unaware of the impending doom. Dive after dive, the pilots released their bombs. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, SRY, erupted in flames almost simultaneously. Explosions ripped through decks, sending planes and men into the sea. Smoke and fire coiled like dragons above the water. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. In minutes, Japan's plan for a decisive strike was obliterated. 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were gone. Yet, in the chaos, Hiryu, the last carrier, remained. Nagumo's forces scrambled for counterattack, desperate to salvage the battle. From Enterprise and Yorktown, radio chatter confirmed the kills. Pilots shouted numbers, positions, damage reports, and sightings of survivors. The Americans had struck a blow beyond expectation, But the battle was not yet over. Above the water, the Pacific burned. Below, sailors clung to wreckage, fighting for life. This was only the first act of a battle that would echo through history. In a matter of hours, the tide of the Pacific had shifted. What Japan had believed to be a perfect strike became the beginning of a disaster. The men, the ships, the courage, all converged in a maelstrom that would mark the turning point of the war. Amid the inferno-consuming Akagi, Kaga, and Hiryu remained intact, the last lifeline of the Japanese strike force. Admiral Nagumo's eyes scanned the horizon from Hiryu's bridge. The pride and fury of his empire now rested on a single ship. Every decision now carried the weight of history. Every mistake could mean annihilation. Hiryu's flight deck buzzed with urgent activity. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers were hastily armed and pushed into the sky. The Japanese hoped to strike back, to salvage their honor, to turn the tide. Across the water, American radar and lookouts reported the takeoff. The ambush was far from over, but the Americans had the advantage of altitude, position, and surprise. From Yorktown, fighters climbed to intercept Hiryu's planes. The dogfight above the Pacific was relentless, American Wildcats and Japanese Zeros locked in a deadly ballet of speed and skill. Each maneuver, each burst of machine gun fire, could mean life or death. Meanwhile, dive bombers positioned themselves for the next attack. They had already proven their precision. Now, they aimed to end the final carrier's threat. At 10:55 a.m., the American dive bombers released their payloads over Hiryu. The bombs found their mark. Decks shattered, fuel ignited, and fires erupted across the carrier. The ship rocked violently under repeated explosions. Sailors fought bravely to control the inferno, but the flames were unstoppable. Within hours, Hiryu was doomed. The last of Japan's carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor would soon sink beneath the Pacific. From the sky, American pilots circled, relaying damage reports. Each message carried the weight of the fleet's survival. Their attacks had crippled Japan's offensive power. 3 of 4 carriers gone, and the last severely damaged, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted in a single morning. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy received reports that would shock their command. The pride of the Japanese fleet lay in flames. What had begun as a meticulously planned ambush had collapsed under the ingenuity, courage, and timing of a few thousand Americans and their pilots. Admiral Yamamoto's vision of a decisive battle, meant to destroy the American fleet, had become a catastrophe. On the American carriers, pilots returned to decks scarred by combat. Many had been shot down, but those who survived were met with cheers and relief. The strike had succeeded, but it had come at a heavy cost. For the first time, the Americans realized the full scope of their achievement. They had turned the tide of war in the Pacific. From Midway, Marines watched smoke rise from the horizon. They understood what it meant. The American Navy had survived, counterattacked, and achieved a stunning victory. The Battle of Midway was not yet over. Ships still maneuvered, aircraft still fought, and the final hours would test every ounce of courage on both sides. As the sun set, the morning's chaos gave way to the grim reality of war. The Japanese Navy had lost its carriers, the heart of its striking power. The Americans had struck a blow from which Japan would never fully recover. But victory had come at a price. Planes lost, men killed, and the haunting knowledge that the Pacific War was far from over. By late afternoon, the Battle of Midway had reached its climax. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were engulfed in flames, their decks shattered, and their air wings destroyed. Hiryu, the last operational carrier, had launched a desperate counterattack, but even its efforts could not reverse the tide. For the Americans, the victory was both exhilarating and sobering. The cost had been high, dozens of planes lost, countless men killed or missing, and the heavy weight of command pressing upon every officer and sailor. On Enterprise and Hornet, flight decks were littered with the wreckage of combat. Pilots returned exhausted, faces streaked with sweat and grime. Yet they were met with a rare sense of triumph, a knowledge that they had struck a decisive blow against a formidable enemy. Below decks, repair crews worked tirelessly. Damage was patched, engines checked, and weapons reloaded. Tomorrow, the Pacific would still be at war. But today, a turning point had been claimed. For the Japanese sailors, the afternoon brought chaos and despair. Decks burned, hangars collapsed, and fires raged uncontrollably. Efforts to save the carriers were heroic but futile. By evening, Hiryu had been fatally damaged, The four-carrier strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was now effectively annihilated. Admiral Nagumo, once confident and composed, now faced the grim consequences of miscalculation and the unseen hand of American intelligence. From Midway, Marines and observers noted the smoke plumes stretching across the horizon. For them, it was confirmation. The island had survived, the American fleet had triumphed, and the momentum of the Pacific War had shifted. Yet even in victory, the cost was clay. American pilots had paid dearly. Many would never return home. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had claimed its share of lives on both sides. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz surveyed the reports coming in. He understood the significance. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in one morning, the Imperial Navy's most powerful vessels. Yamamoto's plan for a decisive strike had failed. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Yet Nimitz also knew the war was far from over. Victory at Midway was not the end. It was the beginning of a long, grueling campaign across an ocean of fire. On Yorktown, the crew allowed themselves a quiet celebration. They had endured the impossible, patched a damaged carrier in May days, launched planes against overwhelming odds, and struck a decisive blow. It was a moment of pride, of hope, and of reflection. For each victory in the air, there was a sacrifice in the water. Every pilot lost, every sailor killed, had contributed to the turning tide of history. The Japanese survivors drifted among the wreckage, facing the unthinkable. The carriers, symbols of their empire's power, lay in ruins. Men clung to life, the Pacific indifferent to their suffering. For the first time, the Imperial Navy faced a reality they could not deny. The Americans had proven themselves capable of victory. As twilight fell, the smoke of battle mingled with the ocean mist. The Battle of Midway was over, a decisive American triumph that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Japan's plan for dominance had collapsed. America had turned the tide, using intelligence, courage, and audacity to strike when least expected. The victory came at a cost, but it was proof that even a battered fleet could stand against the mightiest navy in the world. History would remember June 4, 1942, as the day the Pacific began to change. The day a few men and their machines shifted the destiny of nations. The Battle of Midway was more than a clash of ships and planes. It was a battle of wits, courage, and the unseen hand of intelligence. It was a moment where preparation met opportunity, and the Pacific would never be the same. The dawn after Midway revealed a grim scene. Smoke still curled from the ocean, mingling with sunlight that reflected off shattered decks and drifting wreckage. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a staggering loss. 4 carriers reduced to 3 ablaze and 1 later sunk. Thousands of sailors lost, and the dream of a decisive victory shattered. For the Americans, the victory was profound yet sobering. Ships survived. Pilots survived. A future once uncertain now glimmered with possibility. Admiral Nimitz ordered the surviving carriers to consolidate. Planes were refueled, crews tended, and damage control teams repaired what they could. Though victorious, the Americans understood that Midway was only a turning point, not the end. Intelligence reports poured in from Midway, intercepted communications, and reconnaissance flights. Japan was reorganizing, retreating, and reassessing. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy faced humiliation. The loss of 4 carriers, vessels that had once been the pride of the empire, was catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff reviewed reports with grim faces. The Americans had struck with precision, skill, and intelligence that the Japanese had underestimated. The Imperial Navy would regroup, but the tide had irrevocably shifted. The notion of a quick, decisive victory in the Pacific was gone. Back at Station HYPO, Commander Rochefort and his team continued to intercept and decode Japanese communications. The work that had predicted Midway now focused on understanding Japan's next moves. From these codes, the Americans learned of troop movements, resupply efforts, and fleet repositioning. The once hidden patterns of Japanese strategy were now illuminated by the relentless work of a few brilliant minds. Nimitz seized the initiative. Though weary from Midway, American carriers moved to shadow and pursue the retreating Japanese fleet. The goal was clear: apply pressure, gather intelligence, and prevent Japan from reorganizing easily. Aircraft patrolled vast expanses of ocean, searching for survivors, supply ships, and the remnants of enemy forces. Every sighting, every intercepted transmission, added to the strategic picture. Midway itself became a hub of consolidation. Marine defenders worked alongside Navy personnel to repair airstrips, reinforce defenses, and care for the wounded. The tiny atoll, once thought insignificant, had proven to be the linchpin of Pacific strategy. Its survival marked a psychological and strategic victory. Midway was no longer just an outpost. It was the pivot of America's offensive potential in the Pacific for Japan. Retreat was necessary but painful. Ships limped toward safer waters, while officers debated the next moves. The loss of experienced pilots and carriers could not be replaced quickly. The war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, one where Japan would be forced onto the defensive, buying time as the Americans rebuilt their momentum. Nimitz and his admirals knew the victory at Midway was just the beginning. They planned offensive operations, set priorities for resupply and repair, and considered where the next confrontation with Japan would occur. The Pacific was vast, but the Americans now had confidence. The Japanese could be challenged, defeated, and pushed back. Every decision, every sortie, every repaired plane and ship mattered. As the sun set on June 5, 1942, the aftermath of Midway settled across the ocean. The Japanese Navy had been dealt a decisive blow, yet the war was far from over. America had proven that intelligence, courage, and decisive action could change the course of history. The next battles were already forming on the horizon. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and the vast stretches of the Central Pacific would test the mettle of every sailor, pilot, and marine. Midway was not the end. It was the first triumph in a long, bloody campaign to reclaim the Pacific. The victory at Midway was more than a triumph. It was a turning point. For the first time, America had seized the initiative in the Pacific. No longer reacting to Japanese strikes, the U.S. Navy began to move deliberately, carefully, but with growing audacity. From the decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the men and pilots had learned what courage and strategy could achieve. Their next challenge lay to the south, in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese forces sought to expand and fortify their positions. Admiral Nimitz and his staff studied maps and intelligence reports. The goal was clear: push the Japanese back, regain territory, and establish a forward base for air operations. Midway had been a defensive victory. The Solomons would be the test of offensive capability. The men at the planning tables knew the stakes. Every decision would determine lives, ships, and the balance of power in the Pacific. Guadalcanal, the largest of the Solomon Islands, was of critical strategic importance. Its airfields could control sea lanes and threaten Allied supply lines. The Japanese had begun constructing their own installations, unaware that American forces were already preparing to challenge them. This jungle, remote and unforgiving, would become a battlefield where the mettle of men and machines would be tested to the extreme. From the American carriers, reconnaissance planes took to the skies. Pilots surveyed enemy positions, reported troop movements, and mapped potential landing zones. Every detail mattered. Every observation informed the strategy that would soon bring war to the islands themselves. America had learned from Midway. Knowledge was as lethal as firepower. Japan, still recovering from the loss of 4 carriers at Midway, moved cautiously but urgently. Reinforcements were dispatched to the Solomons. Aircraft, troops, and supply ships were mobilized to strengthen positions, unaware that American forces were already advancing. The stage was set for a protracted conflict, a campaign that would stretch resources, test endurance, and redefine naval warfare in the Pacific. The Marines, hardened by the defense of Midway, began preparations for amphibious operations. Landing craft were inspected. Troops trained in coordination with naval gunfire and air support. The goal was clear: secure the airfield, establish a foothold, and deny the Japanese control of the Solomons. This was the beginning of the American Pacific Offensive, a shift from reaction to determination, from defense to aggressive pursuit. Pilots and crew understood that the coming battles would not be won solely by courage or skill. Strategy, timing, and intelligence would be their weapons. Every takeoff could mean survival or death. Every sortie had the potential to alter the campaign's outcome. From Midway, the Americans had learned the value of patience, precision, and audacity. Now, they would put those lessons into practice. As American forces advanced, Japanese reconnaissance planes were sighted. Skirmishes in the air became inevitable. Each encounter tested tactics and training. American pilots pushed to perfection, using speed, surprise, and maneuver to their advantage. Above the Solomon skies, the first exchanges of the new campaign were unfolding. The Pacific was no longer a distant theater. It was a crucible of fire, steel, and determination, the American Pacific offensive had begun. From Midway to Guadalcanal, the momentum had shifted. Japan, once confident and aggressive, now faced an enemy determined to fight for every island, every mile of ocean, and every strategic foothold. The stage was set for months of grueling combat. Guadalcanal would become the proving ground, a test of courage, endurance, and strategy that would define the American Navy in the Pacific War. The morning air was thick with anticipation, humid and heavy over the jungles of Guadalcanal. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces were taking the offensive on land, not just at sea. Thousands of Marines prepared to land, their craft cutting through coral reefs and waves. The mission: seize the unfinished Japanese A-field at Lunga Point, now known as Henderson Field. Control of this A-field would dictate the flow of the Solomons campaign and the balance of power in the South Pacific. The landing crafts rocked against waves and coral, engines straining under weight. Marines clutched rifles, grenades, and determination. Every man knew the stakes. Japanese defenders were entrenched, and the thick jungle offered both cover and danger. This was a new kind of battle, a combination of amphibious landing, jungle combat, and naval fire support. The Americans were venturing into an unknown crucible, tested only by the resolve honed at Midway and earlier Pacific engagements from the sea. American battleships and cruisers provided covering fire. Shells arched over the waves, striking enemy positions in coordinated barrages. The roar of artillery mingled with machine gun fire from the shore, creating a cacophony of war. Above, SPD Dauntless dive bombers and F-4F Wildcats patrolled the skies, watching for Japanese aircraft. Air, sea, and land were now intertwined in a deadly, coordinated ballet. Japanese troops, well-trained and determined, held the interior jungle. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and fortifications to slow the American advance. Every step inland became a test of endurance, tactics, and sheer willpower. Despite numerical superiority, the Americans were forced to fight for every yard of ground, often encountering hidden machine gun nests and sniper positions. Hours after landing, Marines reached the edges of Henderson Field. The partially completed airstrip represented a prize and a strategic necessity. Securing it would allow American aircraft to operate from the island, threatening Japanese supply lines and giving the Allies an offensive foothold in the Solomons. Yet even as they advanced, the jungle itself became an adversary. Vines, mud, and heat sapped strength, while hidden defenders struck without warning and Japan responded swiftly. From bases at Rabaul, bombers and fighters were dispatched to contest the landing. Air combat erupted over the coastline, with American Wildcat fighters engaging the nimble Zeros in deadly dogfights. The skies above Guadalcanal became a theater of fire and steel, as every sortie carried the potential to shape the campaign. American pilots relied on tactics honed at Midway, altitude advantage, coordinated strikes, and ruthless precision. As Marines pushed deeper, the fighting intensified. Japanese defenders, fighting with the desperation of survival and national duty, launched counterattacks. The Americans responded with grenades, machine gun fire, and coordinated maneuvers, inching forward despite casualties. Every captured ridge, every cleared path, was a victory, yet the cost was visible in the fallen and wounded lying in the MUD.BY midday. Portions of Henderson Field were under American control. Engineers rushed to repair and clear the runway, preparing it for aircraft operations. The A-field, once a symbol of Japanese expansion, was now a beacon of Allied offensive potential. From this point, American forces could project power across the Solomons, challenging Japanese supply and reinforcement routes. As the sun set, Guadalcanal bore the scars of the first major American land offensive in the Pacific. The Marines had secured a foothold, but the battle was far from over. Japanese forces would regroup, launching counterattacks that would turn the island into a grinding test of endurance, skill, and courage. The Solomons campaign had begun, a brutal, unrelenting struggle that would stretch for months and become a defining chapter of the Pacific War. Before dawn, the island lay in uneasy silence. Marines huddled in foxholes, gripping rifles, awaiting the inevitable Japanese counterattack. Guadalcanal was no longer a distant objective. It was a crucible of fire and blood, where every man, every bullet, and every decision mattered. The air was heavy with moisture and anticipation. Mist rolled across the shoreline, cloaking the movements of troops and scouts alike. Inside the dense jungle, Japanese troops prepared to strike. Commanders issued rapid orders, rallying soldiers who had been surprised by the American landings. Ambushes were set along narrow paths, and snipers took positions in the trees above. The intent was clear: drive the Americans back into the sea. But the Americans had learned the lessons of Midway. Coordination, intelligence, and determination could overcome numerical or positional disadvantage. Marines fortified positions around Henderson Field, digging trenches, setting barbed wire, and laying mines. Every inch of the airstrip mattered. Every plane that could land or take off could tip the balance of the campaign. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair runways, clear obstacles, and establish supply lines. Their labor was as vital as the men in the front lines. From the waters offshore, American destroyers and cruisers provided covering fire. Artillery shells screamed across the waves, targeting Japanese positions and providing critical support to advancing Marines. Coordination between sea and land units was unprecedented, and it would define the battle for Guadalcanal. Air patrols from carriers circled overhead, scanning for enemy aircraft, ready to intercept Japanese bombers and fighters. As dawn broke, Japanese forces launched a coordinated counterattack. Marines faced ambushes, machine gun fire, and the relentless advance of enemy troops. In the dense jungle, visibility was limited, and every encounter became a fight for survival. Yet the Americans held. Every ridge, every cleared path, was fiercely defended. The battle was grinding, slow, and brutal. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against both sides. Marines engaged in close-quarters combat, navigating mud, vines, and sudden Japanese attacks. Bayonets, grenades, and rifles became tools of survival. For hours, the jungle rang with the sounds of war, gunfire, explosions, and cries of men fighting for their lives. Every victory was hard-won. Every step forward came at a cost. From Rabaul, Japanese aircraft launched repeated bombing raids on Henderson Field and the surrounding positions. The air was a chaotic dance of steel and fire, as American Wildcat fighters intercepted the incoming formations. Bombs struck runways, supply dumps, and troop positions, but the defenders had prepared for this. Pilots and ground crews worked in tandem, repairing damage under fire, launching counterattacks, and maintaining the critical advantage of air control. By evening, the Marines had secured key positions around Henderson Field. Japanese forces, though relentless, had been repelled for the time being. The cost was high, casualties mounted, and exhaustion weighed on every man. Yet the victory was meaningful. Guadalcanal was in American hands, and the airfield, the key to controlling the Solomons, remained operational. As night fell over Guadalcanal, the island seemed almost calm, but the war had only begun. The Solomons campaign would drag on for months, with jungle warfare, naval battles, and air raids creating an unrelenting cycle of combat. Every man, from the Marines on the front line to the pilots in the sky and the sailors offshore, understood that their courage and endurance would shape the Pacific War. Guadalcanal had become the crucible in which America's resolve and Japan's determination would be tested. A battle of fire, blood, and unyielding spirit. Before the sun rose over Guadalcanal, the jungle was already alive with danger. Marines, weary from continuous combat, prepared for another day of unrelenting struggle. The Japanese, refusing to yield, regrouped in hidden positions, ready to strike at every opportunity. Every tree, every ravine, and every hill became a battleground. The fight for survival was not just about territory. It was about endurance, courage, and willpower. Japanese forces attempted to infiltrate American lines under cover of dawn mist. Small squads advanced silently, aiming to ambush isolated units and disrupt supply lines. Marines relied on scouts, sentries, and rapid communication to detect and repel these attacks. Close combat erupted in the jungle. Bayonets clashed, rifles fired, and grenades exploded in the undergrowth. Every encounter tested nerves and skill in the unforgiving terrain. Meanwhile, Henderson Field remained the prize. Japanese bombers and fighters launched repeated raids, attempting to disable the runway and halt American air operations. American Wildcat and Dauntless pilots engaged with relentless determination, intercepting attackers and defending the critical airstrip. The air above Guadalcanal became a war zone of twisting planes, tracer fire, and roaring engines. Control of the skies was essential. The airfield would determine the outcome of the campaign. In the jungle, Marines pressed forward. Thick foliage and treacherous terrain slowed every advance. Japanese forces used guerrilla tactics, sniping from hidden positions and setting booby traps along narrow paths. Despite exhaustion and loss, the Marines adapted, using teamwork, reconnaissance, and sheer determination to overcome obstacles. Every captured ridge and cleared path brought them closer to consolidating control over the island. Offshore, naval skirmishes continued. Destroyers and cruisers exchanged fire with Japanese ships attempting to reinforce and resupply their island forces. Torpedoes streaked through the water, guns roared, and the ocean churned with destruction. American Naval Command coordinated with ground forces, ensuring supply lines remained open and reinforcements reached the Marines. The battle extended across land, sea, and air. A total war of endurance and strategy. As the day wore on, Japanese counterattacks intensified. The jungle became a maze of death and chaos. Marines fought to maintain positions while under constant threat from artillery, sniper fire, and ambushes. Every hour was a struggle for survival. The soldiers knew that yielding even a small section of the jungle could unravel their hard-won gains. By evening, the Americans had consolidated key positions around Henderson Field. The A Field remained operational, providing a critical base for aircraft to defend the island and strike Japanese positions. The Marines had survived another brutal day, but the cost was evident. Casualties mounted, fatigue weighed heavily, and the relentless stress of combat tested every man. Yet morale remained high. Each victory, no matter how small, was a step toward controlling the island. As night fell, patrols moved through the jungle, listening for movement, securing perimeters, and preparing for inevitable night attacks. The darkness brought new dangers, hidden snipers, booby traps, and the constant threat of surprise assaults. Survival depended on vigilance, courage, and the bond between soldiers. Guadalcanal had become a trial of endurance, a relentless test of human will. Under the silver light of the moon, Guadalcanal rested briefly. The Marines, though battered, had survived another day. The Japanese, relentless in their efforts, planned their next move. This was the nature of the Solomons campaign, a war of attrition fought in mud, jungle, and fire. Every day, every man, every decision carried weighty consequences. Guadalcanal had become the proving ground where courage, strategy, and endurance would decide the fate of the Pacific. Guadalcanal had become a battlefield unlike any other. Marines, entrenched along ridges and in dense jungle, faced relentless assaults from determined Japanese troops. The island was small, the terrain unforgiving, and every advance came at a heavy cost. For the Americans, the challenge was not only to hold ground but to sustain life itself. Food, ammunition, and medical care were as critical as rifles and artillery. Japanese forces continued their attempts to retake positions. Under cover of mist and dense foliage, small squads maneuvered along jungle trails, setting ambushes and counterattacking wherever possible. Marines were forced to fight constantly, often in hand-to-hand combat, to repel these attacks. Every patrol and sentry was a lifeline, and every inch of jungle gained or lost could alter the balance of the battle. Henderson Field remained the lifeblood of the American position. Japanese bombers and fighters from Rabaul and nearby islands launched repeated attacks, aiming to destroy the airstrip and cripple American air power. Wildcats intercepted bombers mid-flight, dive bombers struck Japanese positions, and anti-aircraft gunners held their posts, defending the field with skill and determination. The fight for air superiority was ongoing. Without it, supply and reinforcement would be impossible. Marines pushed further inland, clearing enemy positions, capturing supply caches, and establishing forward defensive lines. The jungle became a deadly maze, where unseen snipers and booby traps awaited. Fatigue, disease, and the oppressive heat took their toll, yet determination drove the men forward. This was attrition warfare in its most brutal form. Victory was measured not only in territory but in survival offshore. American and Japanese ships exchanged fire. Destroyers intercepted supply runs, cruisers engaged enemy vessels, and torpedoes streaked through the water in lethal arcs. The sea was as much a battlefield as the land, and control of supply routes was critical for the success of the campaign. Naval coordination with ground forces allowed for continuous reinforcement and support, keeping the Marines supplied despite Japanese interference. Night brought new dangers. Japanese forces launched infiltrations under the cover of darkness, attempting to surprise American positions. Patrols and sentries engaged in tense firefights, while machine guns and grenades lit up the jungle in bursts of deadly fire. Every Marine knew that survival depended on alertness, courage, and teamwork. Guadalcanal tested not only skill but endurance, with exhaustion becoming a constant enemy alongside the Japanese. Henderson Field was repaired continuously, even under fire. Every landing, every takeoff, allowed American aircraft to strike Japanese positions, resupply isolated units, and defend the Marines holding the island. The airfield symbolized both hope and strategic necessity. Without it, Guadalcanal would have been far more vulnerable. With it, the Americans could wage war across land, sea, and sky, projecting power deeper into the Solomons. By evening, the Marines had held their ground and consolidated key positions. The Japanese had been repelled repeatedly, but the fight was far from over. Guadalcanal was a crucible of attrition, a battle of endurance, strategy, and unyielding resolve. Every day, the men grew more seasoned, their tactics more precise, and their determination unbreakable. Under the moonlight, Guadalcanal rested briefly, but the war raged on. Marines, sailors, and pilots understood that survival meant vigilance, courage, and relentless effort. The island had become the defining battle of the Pacific Campaign, a test of endurance that would shape the outcome of the war. Attrition and resolve would decide who controlled the Solomons, and with it, the destiny of the Pacific. As Guadalcanal settled into its cycle of fire and blood, Japanese reinforcements began arriving. Transport ships carried troops, supplies, and artillery, determined to reclaim the island from the Americans. The Pacific was a theater of constant movement, and control of the sea lanes would determine the fate of the Solomons. For American forces, intercepting these reinforcements became a priority. Each supply ship destroyed weakened Japanese resolve and capability. In the waters of Guadalcanal, American destroyers patrolled relentlessly. Radar-guided detection allowed them to intercept Japanese convoys, firing torpedoes and engaging in naval artillery duels. Each successful strike prevented enemy troops and supplies from reaching the island, tipping the balance in favor of the defenders. The ocean had become as deadly a battleground as the jungle, and command coordination between sea and land forces was crucial. Henderson Field remained America's lifeline. Repair crews worked continuously, clearing debris and maintaining runways under constant threat of air attack. From the airfield, American aircraft launched reconnaissance missions, struck Japanese positions, and disrupted supply routes. The field's survival was critical. It allowed the Americans to project power across the Solomons and prevent the Japanese from consolidating. Japanese commanders, frustrated by the failure of earlier attacks, planned counterstrikes to regain lost ground. Infantry units, artillery, and coordinated airstrikes were ready to challenge the American positions. The jungle became a labyrinth of ambush points and fortified positions, and every approach was deadly. Despite their losses, Japanese forces remained determined. Each man knew the strategic importance of Guadalcanal. American Marines, aware of the incoming assaults, reinforced their positions. Trenches were deepened, machine gun nests fortified, and artillery emplacements readied. Every soldier understood the stakes. Holding Guadalcanal meant survival for thousands and the ability to continue the Pacific offensive. Training and experience from previous engagements allowed the Marines to anticipate enemy tactics and respond with precision. Coordination between the Navy and Marines was crucial. Aircraft from Henderson Field scouted Japanese movements, while naval artillery provided support to repel landing attempts. American planes intercepted Japanese bombers and fighters, ensuring the island's defenders maintained air superiority. Every operation was a calculated risk. Mistakes could lead to disaster, but success meant survival and strategic advantage. By afternoon, Japanese forces advanced from multiple directions. Jungle paths became battlegrounds as Marines engaged in firefights, clearing fortified positions and repelling enemy assaults. Grenades, machine guns, and rifles became tools of survival as the Americans fought to maintain control of the airfield and nearby ridges. Each counterattack was fierce, but the defenders' coordination, discipline, and knowledge of the terrain proved decisive. The Marines, reinforced by fresh troops and supplies from naval convoys, began pushing back against Japanese positions. They captured strategic points, reclaimed lost ground, and strengthened defenses around Henderson Field. The struggle was relentless, and casualties mounted, but morale remained strong. Every victory reinforced the belief that Guadalcanal could be held, and that the Pacific offensive could continue. As night fell, Guadalcanal bore the scars of another day of battle. Marines had survived counterattacks, held the airfield, and repelled reinforcements. The Japanese, though persistent, had been checked and delayed. The battle for Guadalcanal was a war of endurance, strategy, and determination. Every man, from ground troops to pilots and sailors, played a vital role in securing the island's future and shaping the Pacific campaign. Weeks of brutal combat had forged the American forces into a battle-hardened unit. Marines, sailors, and pilots had survived relentless Japanese assaults, jungle disease, and the unforgiving heat. The tide of battle, once uncertain, was beginning to turn. Henderson Field remained secure, a symbol of American resilience and a launching point for offensive operations against Japanese positions. Reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously through dense jungle, mapping enemy positions, supply caches, and fortified points. Each report allowed commanders to plan effective counterattacks and anticipate Japanese maneuvers. Knowledge of terrain and enemy disposition became a decisive factor in the campaign. The Americans were no longer merely defending, they were beginning to dictate the terms of engagement. Offshore, the battle continued to rage. American destroyers intercepted Japanese supply runs, while cruisers engaged in artillery duels. Control of the sea lanes ensured that reinforcements and supplies reached the Marines, while Japanese attempts were increasingly thwarted. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, toward the Americans. With intelligence from patrols and air reconnaissance, Marines launched coordinated counterattacks against entrenched Japanese positions. Artillery and naval gunfire softened targets, while infantry advanced through the jungle. Ambushes, booby traps, and sniper fire slowed progress, but persistence and discipline carried the day. Every ridge captured, every path cleared, brought the Americans closer to controlling the entire island. Japanese commanders, realizing the Americans had gained momentum, tried to reinforce their troops. Transport ships, barges, and aircraft brought in soldiers and supplies under fire. But American patrols, aircraft, and naval forces intercepted many of these reinforcements, blunting the enemy's strength. The Japanese found themselves on the defensive, reacting to moves already anticipated by the Americans. Henderson Field became the hub of offensive operations. Wildcat fighters patrolled the skies, dive bombers struck enemy positions, and reconnaissance planes provided vital intelligence. Every sortie contributed to the gradual erosion of Japanese control over Guadalcanal. The airfield was more than a runway. It was a weapon, a shield, and a symbol of persistence. By afternoon, Marines were steadily advancing against Japanese fortifications. Jungle paths were cleared, machine gun nests neutralized, and snipers hunted down. The battle was grueling and relentless, but discipline, training, and determination prevailed. The Americans were finally seizing the initiative, pushing Japanese forces back and consolidating control over strategic points. Coordination between ground forces, naval artillery, and aircraft became increasingly effective. Shellfire softened targets ahead of infantry movements, dive bombers disrupted enemy formations, and wildcats maintained air superiority. Guadalcanal was being systematically transformed from a contested battlefield into a secured American stronghold. The combined arms approach showcased lessons learned from Midway and earlier engagements. As night fell, the Americans had solidified their gains. The Japanese, though resilient, were increasingly constrained, their counterattacks faltering. Morale among the Marines soared. The island was finally within their grasp. Guadalcanal had become a turning point in the Solomons campaign, a testament to endurance, strategy, and courage. The tide had turned. Guadalcanal, once a symbol of Japanese expansion, was now a bastion of American strength. From the jungle to the airfield, from the coastline to the surrounding waters, the momentum of the Pacific War was shifting. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue, but the outcome was increasingly clear. Determination, strategy, and coordination could overcome even the fiercest opposition. After months of brutal combat, the struggle for Guadalcanal was reaching its climax. American forces, battle-hardened and coordinated, had gained the upper hand. The Japanese, weakened by attrition, supply shortages, and relentless American attacks, were forced to reconsider their position. The island, once a symbol of Japanese expansion, was transforming into a bastion of Allied power in the South Pacific. Marines worked tirelessly to consolidate their positions. Trenches were reinforced, observation posts established, and defensive lines secured along every ridge and approach. Henderson Field remained operational, allowing American aircraft to maintain pressure on Japanese positions and provide critical reconnaissance. Every improvement strengthened the Americans' hold and prepared them for the inevitable Japanese counterattacks. ATC. American destroyers and cruisers intercepted Japanese attempts to reinforce the island. Supply ships were sunk, landing barges destroyed, and enemy movement disrupted. Control of the surrounding waters was essential. Guadalcanal's future depended on denying Japan the ability to resupply and reinforce their troops. The Pacific was proving that naval superiority was just as decisive as land-based combat. From Henderson Field, American aircraft launched continuous strikes on Japanese positions. Dive bombers destroyed supply depots, strafing runs disrupted troop movements, and reconnaissance planes provided critical intelligence. The Japanese were harried on all sides, by land, air, and sea, their ability to counterattack increasingly constrained. Every sortie reinforced the American strategic advantage. In the jungle, Marines pushed into remaining Japanese strongholds. Entrenched defenders fought fiercely, but numbers, coordination, and morale favored the Americans. Machine gun nests were neutralized, snipers eliminated, and supply caches captured. The once impenetrable jungle was being cleared, and the island slowly fell under Allied control. By mid-October, Japanese commanders recognized the futility of continued resistance. Weakened troops, dwindling supplies, and unrelenting attacks left them with no choice: evacuation. Ships moved under cover of darkness, extracting remaining forces from the island. The tide had turned decisively. Guadalcanal would remain in American hands, marking a crucial victory in the Pacific campaign. With the Japanese retreat, Marines consolidated their positions. Henderson Field was fully operational, the surrounding jungle secured, and supply lines established. The island now served as a launching point for further operations in the Solomons and beyond. The victory was strategic, psychological, and symbolic, proof that American forces could hold, fight, and dominate in the Pacific. Guadalcanal had been won. Months of grueling combat, attrition, and determination had culminated in a decisive Allied victory. The Japanese were forced onto the defensive, and the Americans had secured a critical foothold in the South Pacific. The lessons learned here, in jungle warfare, amphibious operations, air support, and naval coordination, would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was more than an island. It was a symbol of resolve, strategy, and the unyielding spirit of those who fought to hold it. With Guadalcanal secured, American forces were ready to expand the Pacific offensive. The victory had shifted the momentum, proving that Japan could be challenged, and islands once thought untouchable could be seized. Commanders in Washington and Pearl Harbor now planned further operations, targeting strategic points across the Solomons and the broader South Pacific. Every island taken would tighten the net around Japanese supply lines and restrict their ability to launch attacks. The fleet, battle-hardened from Midway and Guadalcanal, moved with precision. Carriers launched reconnaissance planes, cruisers scouted for enemy activity, and destroyers patrolled against submarine threats. Each movement was part of a carefully coordinated plan to establish dominance across the Solomons and prepare for future operations. The Pacific had become a vast chessboard, with islands as pieces and naval power dictating the pace of the game. Amphibious operations were meticulously planned. Marines trained in coordination with naval bombardment and air cover. Landing craft were inspected, supplies packed, and intelligence reports studied. The goal: secure key islands, establish forward bases, and prevent the Japanese from regaining lost ground. Every detail mattered. Success would hinge on timing, precision, and the courage of those on the front lines. Japan, recovering from the loss at Guadalcanal, deployed reconnaissance and reinforcement efforts across the Solomons. Aircraft scouted American movements, and small naval units attempted to disrupt supply lines. But the Allies, having learned from Midway and Guadalcanal, anticipated many of these maneuvers, intercepting ships and planes before they could make an impact. The balance of initiative had shifted irrevocably. Marines stormed beaches, clearing obstacles under fire. Japanese defenders, though entrenched, were often outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Naval gunfire and air support softened resistance, while infantry advanced inland, securing key positions. The strategy of island hopping had begun, bypassing heavily fortified areas and focusing on strategically vital islands, gradually moving closer to Japan itself. ATC. Skirmishes continued. American destroyers intercepted Japanese convoys, while cruisers engaged in artillery duels. Submarines prowled the waters, striking enemy supply lines. Control of the sea lanes was critical. The campaign's success depended on preventing Japan from reinforcing and resupplying their garrisons. Once islands were secured, engineers rushed to build airfields. These bases allowed fighters and bombers to extend their reach, striking Japanese positions and providing reconnaissance across wider areas. The airfield network became the backbone of the Pacific offensive, amplifying the impact of every operation. From these footholds, the Allies could project power deeper into enemy territory. American commanders studied maps, reports, and intelligence to plan the next moves. Every island taken brought new opportunities and challenges. Supply lines had to be secured, naval superiority maintained, and airfields protected. The Solomons campaign had become a proving ground, a test of coordination, strategy, and endurance that would shape the broader Pacific War. As the sun set over the Solomons, the Allies held the momentum. Guadalcanal was secured, new islands were under American control, and Japanese forces were increasingly on the defensive. The Pacific offensive was expanding, setting the stage for a series of campaigns that would bring the war ever closer to Japan itself. The lessons of Midway and Guadalcanal guided every operation. Intelligence, coordination, and resolve were decisive. The stage was set for the next wave of battles in the Pacific, battles that would test courage, strategy, and the limits of endurance. With Guadalcanal secured, the battle for the Solomons entered a new, more intense phase. American forces were no longer merely defending, they were advancing, taking the fight to Japanese positions across the archipelago. Every island became a strategic objective, and the Pacific became a theater of constant vigilance and engagement. The Japanese, though shaken by earlier losses, were determined to regain control, setting the stage for protracted and grueling combat offshore. Naval forces clashed with increasing ferocity. American destroyers and cruisers intercepted Japanese convoys attempting to resupply or reinforce positions. Torpedoes streaked through the water, artillery shells screamed across the waves, and night engagements became increasingly deadly. Control of the sea lanes was critical. Without it, no island could be held or supplied. Every victory at sea directly influenced the campaign on land. Marines trained rigorously for upcoming landings on enemy-held islands. Amphibious craft were loaded with troops, weapons, and supplies. Every landing would be a test of coordination. Naval bombardment, air cover, and infantry assault had to operate as one seamless force. The Americans were determined to maintain momentum, striking before the Japanese could consolidate defenses. Japanese forces fortified islands with bunkers, trenches, and hidden machine gun nests. Their goal, delay American advances, inflict maximum casualties, and protect strategic airfields. But their supply lines were strained, and each attempt to reinforce positions faced increasing risk from Allied naval and air patrols. The stage was set for bitter, close-quarters combat. The first waves hit the beaches. Marines charged forward under enemy fire, dodging machine guns, artillery, and mines. Naval bombardment softened defenses, while aircraft strafed enemy positions, clearing paths for infantry. Every foot gained was contested fiercely. The jungles and beaches became a crucible of determination and endurance. Beyond the beaches, the jungle was equally deadly. Marines faced snipers, booby traps, and hidden artillery positions. Close-quarters fighting became the norm. Rifles, grenades, and bayonets were used in relentless engagement. Every victory cost blood, sweat, and exhaustion. Yet each step forward strengthened American control and morale above. The skies were filled with aircraft. Wildcats engaged Zeros, dive bombers struck enemy positions, and reconnaissance planes scouted reinforcements. Air superiority became a decisive factor, allowing the Americans to dictate the pace of operations on land and sea. Each sortie carried risk, but every success chipped away at Japanese defenses. Once islands were secured, engineers rushed to build airfields, roads, and supply depots. These outposts extended the reach of Allied forces, allowing them to project power deeper into the Solomons. The island-hopping strategy was in full effect. Bypass heavily defended positions and focus on capturing strategic points that would enable further advances. Coordination across land, sea, and air was proving to be the key to success. As night fell, American forces regrouped, resupplied, and prepared for the next offensive. The Solomons campaign was proving to be a war of endurance, strategy, and attrition. Every island captured, every engagement won, strengthened the Allies' position and paved the way for the eventual advance toward Rabaul and beyond. The campaign in the Solomons had intensified. From Guadalcanal to newly captured islands, the Americans were now on the offensive, forcing Japan to react and defend positions across the archipelago. The Pacific was becoming a chessboard of strategy, coordination, and unrelenting combat. Every victory and every lesson learned would bring the Allies one step closer to victory in the Pacific. By December 1942, the Pacific offensive was in full swing. American forces, battle-hardened from Guadalcanal and earlier operations, had begun a systematic campaign across the Solomons. Every island captured expanded Allied reach, tightened control over Japanese supply lines, and set the stage for future operations deeper into the Pacific. Commanders coordinated land, sea, and air forces with unprecedented precision, learning from past victories and mistakes. American naval convoys moved carefully through the archipelago, scouting for Japanese ships and submarines. Destroyers patrolled aggressively, cruisers provided fire support, and aircraft from carriers maintained aerial surveillance. Every convoy intercepted or defended became a critical piece of the campaign. Success at sea ensured success on land. The ocean itself was a battlefield, and naval control dictated the pace of the campaign. Marines trained relentlessly for landings on enemy-held islands. Every operation required coordination, naval bombardments to weaken defenses, airstrikes to suppress opposition, and infantry to secure beaches and inland positions. Timing and precision were critical. Mistakes could mean disaster for landing forces. The island-hopping strategy was no longer theoretical. It was being executed with deadly efficiency. Japanese forces fortified their positions with trenches, bunkers, and hidden machine gun nests. Reinforcements were sent whenever possible, but American reconnaissance, airstrikes, and naval patrols intercepted many of these attempts. The Japanese were increasingly forced onto the defensive, reacting to moves already anticipated by Allied command. The war of attrition was shifting in favor of the Americans. Landing craft approached enemy beaches under fire. Marines disembarked, charging forward through surf, sand, and defensive obstacles. Naval gunfire and aircraft support cleared paths, but resistance was fierce. Every advance was measured in yards, every victory paid for in blood. Close-quarters combat, jungle navigation, and tactical coordination defined the brutal reality of the Solomons campaign. Beyond the beaches, the jungle became a labyrinth of danger. Japanese snipers, ambushes, and booby traps slowed American progress. Yet Marines adapted, using reconnaissance, teamwork, and small unit tactics to overcome obstacles. Each engagement reinforced the importance of training, discipline, and perseverance. Above the islands, Wildcats engaged enemy fighters while dive bombers struck entrenched positions. Reconnaissance aircraft mapped enemy movements and identified critical targets. Air superiority became decisive, allowing land forces to operate with relative security and striking the enemy's ability to resist. Coordination between air and ground units defined the effectiveness of every operation. Once islands were captured, engineers and troops worked to secure them. Airfields were rapidly constructed, supply depots established, and defensive positions strengthened. These forward bases extended American reach deeper into the Solomons, allowing for continuous pressure on Japanese forces in preparation for the next offensive. The island-hopping campaign was now a relentless push toward the heart of Japanese-held territory. As night fell, troops regrouped, resupplied, and prepared for the next offensive. The Solomons campaign was proving to be a war of endurance, skill, and strategy. Every island captured reinforced the Americans' momentum, tightening the noose around Japanese operations in the region. Victory in the Pacific was no longer a distant goal. It was a tangible reality, built island by island. The Pacific offensive continued. From Guadalcanal to newly captured islands, the Americans pressed the attack, forcing Japan into a defensive posture across the Solomons. Coordination, strategy, and relentless effort defined each operation, bringing the Allies closer to victory. The Solomons campaign was more than a series of battles. It was a proving ground for tactics, endurance, and the unyielding spirit of those fighting to reclaim the Pacific. By January 1943, the Solomons campaign had entered a critical phase. American forces were focused on securing newly captured islands and fortifying positions to prevent Japanese counterattacks. Every foothold gained in the archipelago brought the Allies closer to dominating the South Pacific. From the dense jungle to the surrounding waters, Vigilance and coordination were paramount. Marines worked tirelessly to consolidate positions. Defensive lines were reinforced, supply caches established, and observation posts placed to monitor enemy movements. Every ridge, every beachhead, and every airfield was secured with meticulous care. The goal was clear: make each island a stronghold from which to project further power and prevent the Japanese from reclaiming lost ground. Japanese forces, though increasingly on the defensive, attempted reconnaissance and harassment operations. Small units probed American lines, seeking vulnerabilities and disrupting supply routes. However, superior intelligence, air patrols, and naval presence allowed the Americans to intercept and neutralize most of these efforts. The balance of initiative was now firmly in Allied hands. American naval forces maintained strict control over the surrounding waters. Destroyers and cruisers patrolled aggressively, intercepting enemy supply convoys and providing fire support for troops onshore. Submarines and aircraft targeted Japanese shipping, gradually eroding the enemy's capacity to reinforce positions. Control of the sea lanes ensured that every captured island could be supplied and defended effectively. Airfields on captured islands allowed American aircraft to extend their operational reach. Fighters provided air cover, bombers struck Japanese positions, and reconnaissance planes mapped enemy movements. The combination of air superiority, naval power, and ground forces allowed for rapid consolidation of each island captured. The island-hopping strategy was now in full execution, bypassing heavily defended areas while securing strategic positions. In the dense jungles, small groups of Japanese troops attempted resistance. Marines carried out patrols, ambushes, and clearing operations to eliminate pockets of enemy forces. The jungle, once an obstacle, became a managed battlefield where disciplined coordination minimized American casualties while neutralizing threats. Every successful patrol strengthened the security of the island and allowed for further expansion. American forces launched coordinated assaults on remaining Japanese strongholds. Naval gunfire softened enemy defenses, aircraft disrupted reinforcements, and infantry advanced methodically. Despite fierce resistance, the combined arms approach ensured success, and positions once held by Japan fell systematically into Allied control. Each victory reinforced the momentum of the campaign. As evening fell, Marines rotated units, resupplied, and strengthened fortifications. Observation posts, bunkers, and artillery positions ensured that the island could withstand any potential counterattack. Henderson Field and other airstrips were fully operational, providing a network of support for further operations deeper into Japanese-held territory. The Solomons campaign was transitioning from offensive operations to consolidation and defense. By securing the Solomons, the Allies had established a firm foothold in the South Pacific. Japanese forces were on the defensive, supply lines were disrupted, and American forces could now project power further into the Pacific. The lessons of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Isle Solomons operations had been learned and applied. The Pacific offensive was no longer tentative. It was methodical, relentless, and increasingly unstoppable. With the Solomons secured, American forces were poised to push further into Japanese-held territory. The Pacific offensive was expanding, targeting islands that could serve as airfields, naval bases, and logistical hubs. Every capture brought the Allies closer to isolating Japan and cutting off their ability to project power across the Pacific. The lessons learned from Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons guided every operation. Precision, coordination, and intelligence were paramount. American naval fleets maneuvered with purpose. Carriers launched reconnaissance aircraft, destroyers patrolled against submarines, and cruisers were ready to provide fire support. The Pacific was a chessboard, with each ship and aircraft apiece moving toward strategic objectives. Control of the sea lanes allowed forces to strike rapidly and sustain supply lines for extended campaigns. Amphibious operations were meticulously planned. Troops, supplies, and artillery were loaded into landing craft, coordinated with naval gunfire and air support. Reconnaissance teams identified enemy positions and weaknesses, allowing for targeted assaults. The objective was clear: secure islands with minimal casualties while maximizing operational efficiency. Japanese forces, aware of American advances, fortified key islands with bunkers, trenches, and artillery. Supply shortages and logistical challenges limited their ability to reinforce positions effectively. The Allies' growing control of sea and air lanes made resupply increasingly difficult, tipping the strategic balance. Every engagement tested endurance, courage, and tactical ingenuity. Marines stormed the beaches under fire, advancing through surf and sand. Naval bombardment softened defenses, while aircraft strafed enemy positions. Jungle fighting followed, as entrenched Japanese defenders resisted fiercely. Every yard gained was contested, every victory carried a cost. But American coordination, discipline, and experience ensured steady progress above. American aircraft dominated the skies. Fighters engaged Japanese Zeros, dive bombers struck artillery positions, and reconnaissance planes mapped enemy movements. Air superiority allowed ground forces to operate more effectively, reducing the threat of counterattack and enabling sustained advances. Every sortie reinforced the offensive and degraded Japanese defensive capability. ATC. Submarines and destroyers intercepted Japanese convoys attempting to resupply islands. Artillery duels erupted with enemy cruisers, while aircraft targeted shipping lanes. Control of the surrounding waters ensured that American forces could sustain offensive operations and deny the Japanese the ability to respond effectively. The campaign was now a war of attrition across land, sea, and air. Once islands were secured, engineers built airfields, roads, and supply depots. Defensive positions were strengthened, observation posts established, and troops rotated to maintain readiness. Each island became a stepping stone for the next operation, expanding Allied reach deeper into Japanese territory. The Pacific offensive was methodical, relentless, and increasingly unstoppable. As the sun set over the Pacific, American forces consolidated gains and prepared for the next phase. The expansion of the offensive was transforming the war in the Pacific, bringing the Allies closer to Japan and weakening enemy morale and capability. The campaign would continue, island by island, battle by battle, until the Pacific was fully within Allied control. By mid-1943, the Allies turned their sights to New Georgia, a strategic island in the Central Solomons. Its airfields and position threatened supply lines and Japanese defensive networks. Capturing New Georgia was essential for the continued island-hopping campaign, bringing the Allies closer to Rabaul and the Japanese heart of operations in the South Pacific. The battle ahead would be grueling. Dense jungle, swamps, and fortified enemy positions awaited Marines and Army units trained meticulously for the landings. Landing craft were loaded with troops, weapons, and artillery, coordinated with naval bombardments and air support. Reconnaissance planes mapped enemy positions, identifying Japanese bunkers, artillery placements, and jungle pathways. Every detail mattered. The success of the operation depended on timing, coordination, and the courage of those on the front lines. Japanese defenders were entrenched, anticipating the Allied assault. Bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests were hidden amidst the jungle, swamps, and ridges. Artillery pieces were camouflaged, ready to unleash devastating fire on any approaching landing craft. Despite supply shortages and fatigue, the Japanese were determined to hold the island at all costs. The first waves hit the beaches under intense enemy fire. Marines advanced through surf and sand, dodging artillery shells, mines, and machine gun fire. Naval gunfire and air strikes suppressed Japanese defenses, but the battle was far from easy. Every yard gained was hard-fought, every step forward paid for in blood and sacrifice. Beyond the beaches, the jungle became a deadly maze. Snipers, booby traps, and hidden artillery slowed the advance. Marines and soldiers relied on reconnaissance, small unit tactics, and coordinated assaults to push deeper into enemy territory. The terrain tested endurance, discipline, and the resolve of every man fighting for control of New Georgia. American aircraft provided critical support. Dive bombers struck Japanese artillery positions, fighters engaged enemy planes, and reconnaissance aircraft identified troop movements. Air superiority ensured that ground forces could advance with reduced risk from enemy air attacks, and that reinforcements and supplies could reach forward positions. Every sortie reinforced the momentum of the campaign. At sea, American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Torpedoes, gunfire, and coordinated maneuvers disrupted enemy movements. Submarines patrolled stealthily, striking enemy shipping and further weakening Japanese logistical support. Control of surrounding waters was essential to the success of the New Georgia campaign. Once key areas were captured, engineers and troops fortified positions. Bunkers were reinforced, observation posts established, and supply lines secured. Airfields were expanded and made operational, allowing the Allies to project air power further into the Solomons. The island-hopping strategy advanced systematically, Isolating strongholds and focusing on strategically vital positions. As the sun set, troops regrouped, resupplied, and prepared for further advances. The campaign for New Georgia showcased the intensity of jungle warfare, the necessity of coordination across land, sea, and air, and the resilience of the Allied forces. Every victory reinforced the Allied momentum and brought them closer to the eventual capture of Rabaul Bougainville. A critical island in the northern Solomons had become the next objective in the Pacific offensive. Its strategic location offered airfields capable of projecting Allied power toward Rabaul and further isolating Japanese positions. Capturing Bougainville would tighten the Allied grip on the Solomons and advance the campaign toward Japan itself. The battle ahead would be intense, combining land, sea, and air operations in one of the Pacific's most challenging terrains. Marines and Army units prepared meticulously for the landings. Landing craft were loaded with troops, artillery, and supplies, coordinated with naval bombardments and air cover. Reconnaissance planes had scouted beaches and inland trails, revealing Japanese defensive positions and fortified bunkers. Every detail mattered. Success depended on precision, timing, and the courage of the men on the front lines. Japanese defenders were well prepared, having fortified beaches, jungle paths, and ridge lines. Machine gun nests, artillery, and hidden bunkers awaited the landing forces. Despite isolation and supply challenges, Japanese soldiers were determined to hold Bougainville at all costs. The terrain, dense jungle, swamps, and ridges, would test the resolve of every attacker. The first waves of Marines hit the beaches under heavy fire. Artillery and naval bombardments softened enemy positions, while aircraft strafed bunkers and artillery placements. The Marines advanced through surf and sand, facing fierce resistance at every step. Every foot gained was hard-won, every yard contested in brutal combat. Beyond the beaches, the jungle became a deadly labyrinth. Japanese snipers, booby traps, and hidden artillery made every advance perilous. American forces relied on reconnaissance, coordinated small unit tactics, and artillery support to push inland. The fighting was intense, exhausting, and relentless, but every victory strengthened the Allies' hold on the island. Air support was crucial. Fighters engaged Japanese aircraft, dive bombers struck artillery positions, and reconnaissance planes monitored troop movements. Air superiority allowed American ground forces to advance more effectively and reduced the risk from enemy counterattacks. Every sortie contributed to isolating Japanese forces and weakening their ability to resist. At ATC, American warships intercepted Japanese attempts to reinforce the island. Destroyers and cruisers engaged enemy ships, while submarines struck at supply lines. The ocean became a battleground, and control of the surrounding waters ensured that reinforcements could not reach Japanese positions. Naval dominance was as critical to victory as ground combat. Once key areas were secured, engineers fortified positions, established supply depots, and built airfields. These forward bases allowed the Allies to project air power deeper into the Solomons and maintain pressure on Japanese forces. The island-hopping strategy continued, focusing on strategically vital positions while bypassing heavily defended areas. Coordination across land, sea, and air ensured that every captured position strengthened the overall campaign. As night fell, American troops regrouped, rotated units, and prepared for the next offensive. The battle for Bougainville demonstrated the intensity of Pacific warfare, a combination of jungle combat, amphibious assaults, airstrikes, and naval engagements. Every step forward brought the Allies closer to isolating Japanese strongholds and advancing toward ultimate victory in the Pacific. With the beaches secured, American forces began the arduous push inland on Bougainville. Dense jungle, swamps, and rugged terrain made every advance difficult, while Japanese forces, determined to resist, had fortified every ridge and valley. The campaign had become a test of endurance, strategy, and coordination across land, sea, and air. Victory required patience, discipline, and unrelenting determination. Marines navigated narrow trails, cutting through thick foliage while maintaining tactical formation. Snipers, hidden machine gun nests, and booby traps made every step perilous. Patrols scouted ahead, mapping Japanese positions and reporting enemy movements to command. Every successful patrol ensured that infantry units could advance with reduced risk and more effective coordination. The Japanese defenders utilized every advantage the jungle offered. Bunkers hidden among dense foliage, artillery positions camouflaged on ridges, and ambush points along river crossings made each advance costly. Despite dwindling supplies and isolation, the defenders were tenacious, forcing American forces to adapt their tactics constantly. The jungle itself had become a weapon in enemy hands. American artillery and air strikes softened enemy positions ahead of infantry advances. Bombers targeted fortified bunkers, naval gunfire disrupted defensive lines, and reconnaissance aircraft relayed critical intelligence. Coordination of firepower allowed Marines to reduce casualties while maintaining momentum against entrenched forces. Each combined operation was a demonstration of learning from previous Pacific battles. Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Fighting in the jungle was brutal. Rifle fire, grenades, and bayonets replaced the long-range duels of open terrain. Every ridge, every river crossing, and every clearing was contested fiercely. The physical and psychological toll was immense, yet discipline and training carried the Americans forward. Every inch gained was testament to courage and persistence. Offshore, American naval forces intercepted Japanese attempts to reinforce their troops. Destroyers engaged enemy ships, while submarines and aircraft targeted supply lines. The inability of Japan to reinforce or resupply their garrisons made their inland defense increasingly untenable. Control of the surrounding seas amplified the effectiveness of ground operations. Once positions were captured, engineers immediately improved infrastructure. Roads were cleared, bunkers reinforced, and airstrips expanded. These forward bases enabled continuous logistical support, allowed aircraft to strike deeper into Japanese territory, and ensured the sustainability of Allied operations. The island-hopping strategy was no longer just about capture. It was about establishing permanent power projection. Despite setbacks, Japanese forces launched counterattacks, attempting to reclaim lost ground. They struck at flanks, set ambushes, and tested the resolve of American troops. Yet coordinated defense, air support, and artillery repelled these attacks, further weakening enemy morale and strength. The tide had shifted. The initiative now belonged firmly to the Allies. As night fell, troops fortified captured positions, rotated units, and resupplied. Observation posts overlooked key trails and ridges, while artillery and air support remained on alert. Every day on Bougainville brought new challenges, but each advance brought the Allies closer to complete control of the island. The campaign had become a battle of endurance, strategy, and persistence. The push inland on Bougainville marked a critical phase of the Pacific offensive. American forces, coordinating land, sea, and air power, overcame the challenges of jungle warfare and enemy resistance. Every foot gained was a step closer to isolating Japanese strongholds and preparing for further operations toward Rabaul and beyond. The battle for Bougainville was a testament to strategic planning, courage, and the relentless pursuit of victory in the Pacific. By early 1944, American forces were focused on securing the heart of Bougainville. With the beaches and initial inland areas under control, the campaign shifted to eliminating remaining Japanese pockets and fortifying key positions. Victory on Bougainville would not only deny Japan a critical base but also establish a springboard for operations further toward Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. The campaign had become a methodical battle of attrition, precision, and endurance. Marines navigated the rugged jungle terrain, advancing ridge by ridge. Japanese snipers and hidden artillery positions slowed the progress, forcing careful reconnaissance and coordinated assaults. Every unit moved deliberately, supported by artillery, airstrikes, and engineers clearing obstacles. The jungle was unforgiving, but discipline and strategy allowed the Americans to maintain momentum. Japanese forces, though increasingly isolated, launched desperate counterattacks. Ambushes along trails, artillery strikes from concealed positions, and sudden engagements tested American resolve. Yet, with superior coordination, air support, and supply lines, every counterattack was repelled, further weakening Japanese morale. The defenders were tenacious, but the campaign's strategic advantage lay with the Allies. American aircraft continued to dominate the skies. Dive bombers destroyed remaining bunkers, fighters intercepted any Japanese planes, and reconnaissance aircraft mapped enemy movements. Artillery units provided precise support, targeting fortifications and disrupting troop concentrations. The combined arms approach minimized casualties while ensuring steady territorial gains. Engineers and logistical units played a vital role. Roads were constructed through the dense jungle, supply depots secured, and forward airstrips expanded. These improvements allowed the rapid deployment of troops and the sustained operation of aircraft, giving the Allies unmatched flexibility and reach. Bougainville was transforming from a contested battlefield into a fully operational forward base. American forces executed coordinated assaults to eliminate remaining Japanese strongholds. Infantry units, supported by artillery and airstrikes, systematically reduced enemy positions. Despite the harsh terrain and fierce resistance, the combination of planning, firepower, and determination ensured success. Every stronghold captured brought the Allies closer to total control of the island. As night fell, American troops fortified newly captured positions, rotated units, and prepared for potential Japanese counterattacks. Observation posts, defensive bunkers, and artillery positions ensured that control of the central island was maintained. The relentless campaign had tested endurance, strategy, and coordination, but each day brought the Allies closer to their objective. Bougainville was nearly secured. By mid-January 1944, the heart of Bougainville was under American control. The remaining Japanese forces were isolated, weakened, and unable to mount significant resistance. Bougainville had become a forward base, strengthening the Allied position in the Northern Solomons and paving the way for the eventual reduction of Rabaul. The island was a testament to coordinated planning, resilience, and the unyielding determination of those fighting in the Pacific. With Bougainville secured, Allied forces turned their attention to Rabaul, the Japanese stronghold and naval center of operations in the Northern Solomons. Rabaul's airfields, naval facilities, and fortified positions made it a critical target. Capturing or neutralizing it was essential for controlling the South Pacific. The campaign would require a combination of naval superiority, air power, and coordinated land operations. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers assembled for the push toward Rabaul. Reconnaissance aircraft scouted enemy positions, submarines patrolled supply lines, and surface ships coordinated bombardments. Every movement was calculated, designed to maximize pressure on Japanese forces while minimizing Allied losses. Control of the seas was a prerequisite for success. Allied commanders meticulously planned the next phase. Airstrikes would weaken defenses, naval bombardments would target fortifications, and amphibious landings on surrounding islands would isolate Rabaul. Coordination between ground, air, and naval units was critical. The campaign would be a demonstration of all that had been learned in the Pacific War thus far. Precision and intelligence would determine success. Rabaul was heavily fortified. Japanese artillery, bunkers, anti-aircraft positions, and fighter planes created a formidable defense network. Allied intelligence revealed the extent of these preparations, allowing planners to target key positions and reduce potential casualties. Yet the defenders were resolute. Fully aware of the strategic importance of the island, Allied air power began the campaign, striking airfields, artillery positions, and supply depots. Naval bombardments softened coastal defenses and disrupted Japanese troop concentrations. Submarines intercepted any attempts to reinforce Rabaul, cutting off supplies and isolating the island. Every sortie, every shell fired, and every maneuver was part of a larger strategy to neutralize Rabaul without a costly frontal assault. Rather than attacking Rabaul directly, American forces executed landings on surrounding islands. These operations bypassed heavily defended positions, established airfields, and cut off Rabaul from potential reinforcements. The strategy of island hopping was now applied at a larger scale, isolating the enemy while strengthening Allied positions. The Northern Solomons became a network of forward bases, each one bringing the Allies closer to their ultimate objective. Despite being increasingly isolated, Japanese forces launched limited counterattacks to protect supply lines and maintain strategic positions. Patrols, artillery strikes, and air sorties tested Allied defenses. Yet Allied coordination, superior firepower, and intelligence allowed them to repel attacks, gradually tightening the noose around Rabaul. The initiative had shifted decisively. On captured islands, engineers constructed airfields and logistical hubs. These bases extended the operational range of Allied aircraft, allowed for reconnaissance over Rabaul, and provided artillery support for any potential assault. The Northern Solomons became a springboard for further operations, demonstrating the cumulative power of methodical planning, logistics, and combat experience. Each foothold reinforced the Allied strategic advantage. As the sun set over the Northern Solomons, Allied forces regrouped and prepared for the next phase. The campaign toward Rabaul demonstrated the integration of lessons learned throughout the Pacific War: intelligence, coordination, and sustained pressure. The next operations would continue the isolation of Rabaul, paving the way for the eventual neutralization of one of Japan's strongest bases in the Pacific. By 1944, Rabaul remained a formidable Japanese stronghold, but Allied strategy had shifted. Instead of a direct assault, the focus was on isolating the base, cutting off supplies, and neutralizing its operational capabilities. Air, sea, and land forces worked in concert to achieve what frontal attacks could not: containment and attrition. The goal was to render Rabaul powerless without costly casualties. Allied aircraft launched relentless attacks on Rabaul's airfields, anti-aircraft positions, and shipping. Bombers destroyed runways, hangars, and fuel depots, while fighters engaged Japanese aircraft and provided cover for reconnaissance missions. Intelligence was critical. Mapping enemy positions and predicting reinforcements allowed precision strikes that maximized damage while minimizing risk. Rabaul's ability to project power was steadily eroding. American and Allied naval forces established a tight perimeter around Rabaul. Destroyers, cruisers, and submarines intercepted supply convoys, while aircraft from carriers patrolled sea lanes. Japanese attempts to reinforce the garrison were intercepted or destroyed, further isolating the stronghold. The oceans themselves became a weapon, preventing the enemy from escaping or resupplying. Amphibious landings on surrounding islands provided airfields, artillery positions, and logistical bases. These islands became forward positions, allowing Allied aircraft to strike deeper into Japanese territory and maintain constant pressure on Rabaul. Each captured island tightened the noose, restricting Japanese options and forcing them into defensive desperation. The island-hopping strategy had reached a new level of sophistication. Japanese defenders attempted countermeasures: anti-aircraft emplacements, submarine operations, and sporadic air sorties. Yet, with their supply lines severed and Allied air and naval superiority, their ability to resist effectively was diminishing. Rabaul's once mighty force was confined, and morale began to falter. Isolation was proving as effective as any assault. Allied submarines, aircraft, and surface ships coordinated strikes on Japanese supply lines. Every convoy intercepted reduced the enemy's ability to maintain forces on Rabaul, while every airstrike destroyed vital infrastructure. The garrison faced starvation, fuel shortages, and diminishing air power, forcing them to rely solely on the limited resources within the base. The stronghold was being methodically neutralized without direct invasion. Continuous reconnaissance allowed Allied forces to monitor Japanese movements and adjust tactics in real time. Mapping hidden gun emplacements, troop concentrations, and supply caches ensured that each strike hit with precision. This intelligence-driven approach made the isolation strategy far more effective than frontal assaults would have been. Every mission reinforced Allied control of the region. As night fell, Allied forces reinforced captured positions on surrounding islands, prepared for further air operations, and maintained naval patrols. Rabaul, once a centerpiece of Japanese operations in the South Pacific, was now effectively cut off. The campaign demonstrated the power of strategy, intelligence, and coordinated operations over sheer brute force. Isolation had become the weapon that would define the next phase of the Pacific War. By mid-1944, Rabaul was neutralized as a threat, despite remaining in Japanese hands. The combination of naval supremacy, relentless air attacks, and strategic island captures had isolated the base, rendering it powerless. The Allies now had a clear path to advance further into the Pacific, tightening their grip on Japan's defensive perimeter and bringing victory closer with each operation. With Rabaul effectively neutralized, Allied planners turned their attention to the liberation of the Philippines. The archipelago represented both a strategic gateway to Japan and a symbol of occupation to be overturned. Planning the campaign required careful coordination of land, sea, and air forces, along with logistics capable of sustaining large-scale amphibious operations. The stage was set for one of the most ambitious campaigns of the Pacific War. Commanders gathered to plan the Philippine campaign in unprecedented detail. Amphibious assaults had to be synchronized with air strikes and naval support, supply chains established across thousands of miles, and troop deployments staggered for maximum effect. Intelligence reports on Japanese troop strength, fortifications, and terrain informed every decision. Precision and preparation would determine success. Thousands of Marines, soldiers, and support personnel underwent intensive training for amphibious landings. landing craft drills, jungle warfare exercises, and coordination with air and naval units were drilled repeatedly. Every unit was honed for the challenge ahead. Capturing the Philippines would require skill, endurance, and unyielding determination. Preparation was the foundation of victory. Allied carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned themselves across the Western Pacific. Aircraft conducted reconnaissance over Philippine waters, mapping enemy positions and identifying navigational hazards. Submarines patrolled strategic choke points, ready to intercept Japanese shipping and reinforce isolation strategies. Control of the sea and air was essential before any landing could begin. Japanese forces had fortified key islands and coastal regions with artillery, bunkers, and anti-aircraft installations. Despite attrition elsewhere in the Pacific, Japan maintained garrisons capable of mounting fierce resistance. Intelligence indicated strongpoints on Leyte, Mindoro, and Luzon. Each island would present unique challenges to invading forces. The Allies faced both strategic and tactical complexity. Thousands of tons of supplies, ammunition, and equipment were staged across forward bases. Airfields, docks, and supply depots were prepared to ensure rapid unloading and distribution once troops landed. Logistics became as critical as combat. Failure to sustain the advance could jeopardize the entire campaign. Every detail, from fuel to rations, was meticulously planned. Troops participated in full-scale amphibious rehearsals on similar terrain to that of the Philippine beaches. Landing craft drills, coordination between infantry and armored units, and timing of air and naval bombardments were refined repeatedly. Every exercise strengthened confidence and ensured units were ready for the realities of combat. Training and preparation minimized uncertainty and maximized combat effectiveness. Reconnaissance teams gathered intelligence on enemy fortifications, minefields, and troop positions. Aerial photography, submarine patrols, and scouting units mapped the terrain to ensure landing zones were optimal. This intelligence-driven approach allowed planners to anticipate obstacles and allocate resources efficiently. Every piece of information increased the likelihood of success. As night fell, troops prepared for deployment. Officers delivered briefings, engineers finalized landing plans, and morale was bolstered with the knowledge that liberation awaited the Filipino people. The stage was set. The Philippines campaign would begin with precision, coordination, and overwhelming force. October the 20th, 1944. A pivotal moment in the Pacific War. American forces, following months of meticulous planning, began the liberation of Leyte, the first step in freeing the Philippines from Japanese occupation. Thousands of troops, supported by artillery, naval bombardments, and aircraft, prepared to storm fortified beaches under enemy fire. This operation would test strategy, courage, and the lessons learned from previous campaigns. Before the first wave landed, Allied ships unleashed heavy bombardments on Japanese coastal defenses. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of shells, targeting bunkers, artillery, and troop concentrations. Simultaneously, aircraft strafed positions and dropped bombs, softening defenses and creating chaos among Japanese forces. The preparatory strike was precise, calculated, and relentless. Landing craft surged forward under fire. Marines and soldiers disembarked into surf, facing mines, artillery, and machine gun nests. Despite fierce resistance, coordinated naval and air support allowed troops to establish beachheads. Every inch gained was a hard-fought victory, securing a foothold for the inland advance. The operation was the culmination of months of preparation. Japanese defenders launched immediate counterattacks, hoping to repel the landings. Artillery fire, mortars, and entrenched infantry engaged the advancing Americans. Yet the overwhelming coordination of land, sea, and air power ensured the beachheads held. The defenders, although determined, faced the superior planning and firepower of the Allies. Once the beaches were secured, American forces began moving inland. Dense jungles, rivers, and road networks became battlefields. Patrols scouted ahead, artillery provided support, and airstrikes targeted key defensive positions. Every village captured, every ridge secured, brought the Allies closer to liberating the island. The operation was methodical, relentless, and strategically essential. Meanwhile, the largest naval battle of the Pacific, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, erupted. Japanese forces launched a desperate attempt to disrupt the landings and destroy the American fleet. Aircraft, battleships, and cruisers engaged in one of the most complex naval confrontations in history. American coordination, intelligence, and superior firepower eventually prevailed. Securing sea control and ensuring the continued advance on Leyte air support played a critical role. Fighters engaged Japanese aircraft attempting to attack landing forces, while bombers targeted supply routes and entrenched positions. Reconnaissance planes mapped terrain and identified enemy movements, allowing ground forces to adjust tactics in real time. Air superiority was decisive in minimizing casualties and maintaining momentum. As the day progressed, American troops consolidated their positions. Fortifications were established, supply lines secured, and artillery placed to support inland advances. Engineers began clearing paths for vehicles and preparing for the arrival of reinforcements. The beachheads became springboards for the continued liberation of Leyte. As night fell over Leyte, American forces regrouped, reinforced, and planned the next day's push. The initial landings had been successful, but the battle for the island had just begun. Every victory, every captured position, brought the Philippines closer to liberation. The initial landings on Leyte had secured the beaches, but the real battle lay ahead. American forces now faced entrenched Japanese positions, dense jungles, and fortified towns. Every step inland demanded coordination, courage, and careful planning. Japanese forces utilized every advantage the terrain offered. Bunkers hidden in hills, sniper positions in forests, and fortified villages slowed the Allied advance. Counterattacks were frequent, using artillery, mortars, and infantry assaults to disrupt supply lines and stall progress. Yet the Americans, with superior firepower and coordination, steadily pushed forward. Infantry units advanced cautiously through the jungle and along roads, supported by artillery and tanks. Patrols scouted ahead, clearing mines and ambush points, while engineers repaired bridges and built roads to maintain supply lines. Every village captured and every ridge secured brought the Allies closer to total control of Leyte. Progress was measured in yards, but each yard was vital. Air support remained critical. Fighters engaged Japanese aircraft, bombers struck enemy fortifications, and reconnaissance planes monitored troop movements. Every strike weakened Japanese defenses and ensured that the American advance could continue with reduced casualties. Air superiority proved decisive in a campaign defined by jungle and urban warfare offshore. American ships maintained control of Leyte Gulf. Naval gunfire supported advancing troops, striking enemy positions near the coastline. Submarines and patrol aircraft intercepted any Japanese reinforcements attempting to reach the island. The seas were as much a battlefield as the land itself. Fighting in towns and villages was intense and close quarters. Japanese defenders fortified buildings and streets, forcing Americans to clear each area systematically. Infantry, supported by engineers and artillery, overcame these defenses while minimizing civilian casualties. Every village captured strengthened the Allied foothold on Leyte. Engineers and supply units worked tirelessly to maintain the advance. Roads, bridges, and depots ensured that troops had ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Without this logistical backbone, the inland offensive could not have succeeded. Victory depended as much on planning and support as on combat itself. Despite fierce initial resistance, Japanese forces began to falter. Supply shortages, relentless air strikes, and continuous pressure from American troops reduced their ability to mount effective counterattacks. Morale declined, and isolated pockets were systematically eliminated. The momentum was firmly in Allied hands. As night fell, American troops fortified positions, rotated units, and planned the next day's inland push. Leyte was slowly being liberated, island by island, ridge by ridge, village by village. Each advance brought the Philippines closer to freedom and struck a decisive blow against Japanese occupation. By late October 1944, the campaign on Leyte had shifted into its final, decisive phase. American forces, having secured beachheads and advanced inland, now faced the task of eliminating remaining Japanese resistance and securing the entire island. Victory depended on coordination, perseverance, and overwhelming force. Japanese troops, weakened by continuous airstrikes, naval bombardments, and isolation, struggled to maintain organized resistance. Reinforcements were scarce, and morale was eroding. The defenders fell back to strongpoints in villages, ridges, and river crossings, hoping to delay the inevitable. American forces, however, pressed relentlessly forward. Infantry units moved with precision, clearing villages and ridge lines, supported by artillery and tanks. Engineers repaired roads, removed obstacles, and ensured supply lines kept pace with the advance. Every ridge secured and every town liberated brought the Allies closer to total control of Leyte. The campaign was methodical, combining skill, strategy, and determination. Air superiority remained a decisive factor. Fighters patrolled the skies, engaging remaining Japanese aircraft, while bombers targeted fortified positions and supply points. Reconnaissance aircraft provided real-time intelligence, allowing ground forces to adjust tactics quickly. The synergy of air and ground forces minimized casualties and accelerated the liberation. Naval forces maintained close coordination with land operations. Destroyers and cruisers provided fire support against coastal positions, while carrier aircraft struck targets further inland. Submarines continued to interdict Japanese reinforcements and supplies attempting to reach Leyte. The integration of land, sea, and air power exemplified modern combined arms warfare. American forces systematically eliminated remaining Japanese positions. Jungle and urban warfare required small unit tactics, careful reconnaissance, and coordinated artillery and air support. Resistance, though fierce in isolated pockets, was increasingly futile against overwhelming firepower and tactical precision. Each victory reinforced Allied control over the island. As towns and villages were secured, Allied forces assisted local civilians. Medical aid, food distribution, and infrastructure repair helped stabilize liberated areas. The liberation of Leyte was not only a military victory but also a humanitarian mission, restoring hope and safety to the Filipino population. By nightfall, American forces had established control over all major positions. Troops fortified key points, supply lines were secured, and airfields expanded for further operations. Leyte was liberated, marking a significant turning point in the Philippines campaign and the Pacific War. Victory here paved the way for the continued push across the archipelago toward Luzon and beyond. With Leyte secured, Allied forces turned their attention to Luzon, the largest and most strategically important island in the Philippines. Luzon's capture would bring Manila, the capital, into reach and strike a critical blow against Japanese command and logistics in the archipelago. Preparation for the largest amphibious assault since Normandy was meticulous, involving land, sea, and air forces in perfect coordination. Thousands of troops, engineers, and support personnel staged across Leyte and nearby islands. Landing craft drills, reconnaissance briefings, and coordination with artillery and air support were refined repeatedly. Every unit trained to anticipate Japanese defenses, fortified positions, and the challenges of Luzon's terrain. Preparation would determine the success of the first wave. Allied carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned themselves along Luzon's coast. Naval gunfire would precede landings, softening enemy fortifications, while submarines patrolled key approaches to intercept Japanese reinforcements. Every maneuver was calculated to ensure maximum support for the troops hitting the beaches. The oceans became both a shield and a weapon in the coming assault. Japanese forces, aware of Luzon's strategic value, fortified beaches, hills, and river crossings. Artillery emplacements, bunkers, and minefields created a layered defense designed to inflict maximum casualties on invading forces. Despite supply shortages and isolation in other parts of the Philippines, Japanese defenders were prepared for a brutal confrontation. The Americans would need precision, courage, and overwhelming firepower to succeed. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, conducting reconnaissance, bombing defensive positions, and intercepting Japanese planes. Fighter sweeps cleared the skies for troop landings, while dive bombers targeted coastal artillery and supply depots. Air superiority ensured that the amphibious assault could proceed with reduced risk from enemy aircraft. The skies were as crucial as the seas and land in this campaign. The first waves of landing craft approached the beaches under intense observation. Artillery and naval bombardments had softened defenses, but Japanese machine gun nests and fortifications still posed deadly threats. Troops hit the sand, moving swiftly to secure a beachhead, supported by tanks and engineers clearing obstacles. Every step forward was a testament to training, discipline, and coordination. Beyond the beaches, dense jungles, rivers, and ridges challenged the advancing troops. Japanese forces used every natural feature for defense, launching counterattacks and ambushes. Patrols scouted ahead, artillery provided cover, and airstrikes neutralized enemy positions. The push inland demanded resilience, adaptability, and constant coordination. American naval units continued to patrol Luzon's coastline, providing fire support and intercepting Japanese supply attempts. Submarines and carrier-based aircraft struck shipping, ensuring that Japanese forces on the island remained isolated. Naval control was essential for both protecting Allied troops and maintaining supply lines. By nightfall, American forces had established secure beachheads and fortified initial positions inland. Engineers cleared paths for reinforcements, supply depots were established, and artillery was placed to support further advances. The campaign to liberate Luzon had begun, marking a decisive stage in the Philippine liberation and the broader push toward Japan. By January 1945, Allied forces had established beachheads on Luzon, but the heart of the island remained under Japanese control. The battle for Luzon would be one of the largest and most complex campaigns of the Pacific War, combining jungle warfare, urban combat, and large-scale amphibious and aerial operations. Victory required precision, coordination, and unyielding determination. Japanese forces had fortified key cities, ridges, and river crossings. Well-placed artillery, bunkers, and entrenched infantry slowed the American advance. Counterattacks were frequent, targeting supply lines and testing the strength of Allied positions. Despite being stretched thin across the island, Japanese troops fought with discipline and desperation. Infantry units, supported by artillery, armor, and engineers, pushed through dense jungle and river valleys. Every ridge, road, and village became a battlefield, with snipers, hidden mortars, and booby traps challenging the advance. Patrols scouted ahead, while artillery and airstrikes softened enemy positions before ground forces engaged. The advance was methodical, precise, and relentless. Allied aircraft dominated the skies above Luzon. Fighters engaged Japanese aircraft, bombers struck fortified positions, and reconnaissance planes mapped terrain for ground forces. Continuous aerial support allowed the advance to continue with reduced risk and increased effectiveness. Air power was the linchpin of the campaign. Naval forces maintained close coordination with ground operations. Destroyers and cruisers provided fire support for troops near the coast, while submarines intercepted Japanese reinforcements and supply convoys. The seas surrounding Luzon were effectively controlled, preventing the enemy from regrouping or reinforcing their positions. As Allied forces advanced toward Manila, the fighting intensified. Japanese defenders transformed the city into a fortress, using buildings, streets, and canals for defense. Infantry units engaged in close-quarters combat, supported by artillery and airstrikes, methodically liberating each district. Every block cleared brought the Allies closer to Manila's liberation. The Luzon campaign demonstrated the power of combined arms operations. Ground troops, supported by air and naval firepower, worked in unison to overcome well-entrenched defenders. Engineers cleared obstacles, medics cared for the wounded, and supply lines ensured continuous operational momentum. Coordination was the difference between costly delays and decisive victory. By mid-January, Japanese forces on Luzon began to weaken. Supply shortages, relentless bombardment, and continuous Allied pressure reduced their combat effectiveness. Although pockets of resistance remained, the overall initiative belonged to the Allies. The liberation of Luzon was approaching its climax. As night fell, Allied forces consolidated their gains, fortified positions, and planned the final push into Manila. Every victory on Luzon brought the Philippines closer to complete liberation, striking a decisive blow against Japanese control. February 3, 1945, the beginning of the climactic battle for Manila. American and Filipino forces, supported by artillery and air power, launched the assault on the Japanese-occupied capital. The city had been heavily fortified, with Japanese troops determined to turn Manila into an impregnable fortress. Victory would require courage, coordination, and unrelenting pressure. Japanese forces had transformed Manila into a maze of fortifications. Streets, buildings, bridges, and canals were heavily defended with artillery, machine guns, and snipers. Counterattacks were frequent, aimed at slowing the Allied advance and inflicting maximum casualties. The defenders fought with desperation, knowing that the fall of Manila would signal the collapse of Japanese control in the Philippines. Allied infantry moved block by block, street by street, clearing Japanese positions. Close-quarters combat was intense. Rifle fire, grenades, and flamethrowers were used to neutralize entrenched defenders. Engineers cleared obstacles and repaired bridges, enabling tanks and artillery to support the advance. Each street captured brought the city closer to liberation, Artillery units pounded enemy positions, while airstrikes targeted fortified buildings and supply points. Precision bombing minimized civilian casualties, while destroying key Japanese defensive positions. The integration of air and ground operations allowed the Allies to maintain momentum through the urban battlefield. Filipino guerrilla forces, familiar with the city's terrain, assisted Allied troops. They provided intelligence, guided units through hidden routes, and helped neutralize isolated enemy pockets. The collaboration between local forces and American troops was crucial to accelerating Manila's liberation. Naval units in Manila Bay provided bombardment support for ground operations. Artillery fire targeted Japanese positions along the coastline and rivers, preventing enemy reinforcements or escape. Control of Manila Bay ensured that the city could be supplied and reinforced as needed, supporting continuous operations. Fierce fighting took place around government buildings, bridges, and strategic crossroads. Japanese defenders employed snipers, booby traps, and small unit counterattacks to slow the Allied advance. Each captured district represented a significant step toward reclaiming the city and restoring control. Amid the battle, Allied forces prioritized civilian safety where possible. Medical aid, evacuation of trapped residents, and protection of hospitals were coordinated alongside combat operations. The liberation of Manila was as much about restoring safety and hope to the population as it was about defeating Japanese forces. By evening, Allied forces had secured most of Manila. Remaining Japanese units retreated into isolated pockets, quickly neutralized by coordinated infantry, artillery, and air operations. The city was slowly liberated, marking a decisive turning point in the Philippine campaign. By early March 1945, Luzon was largely under Allied control. The liberation of Manila had dealt a decisive blow to Japanese operations, but pockets of resistance remained across the island. Mop-up operations, fortification of strategic positions, and stabilization of liberated areas were critical to securing the entire island and preparing for further operations in the Pacific. Small Japanese units continued to resist, hiding in jungles, mountains, and fortified villages. Allied patrols systematically sought out and neutralized these pockets, using reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, and air support. The combination of intelligence and overwhelming firepower ensured that resistance was gradually eliminated. Engineers repaired bridges, cleared roads, and rebuilt airfields to maintain supply lines. Medical units treated wounded soldiers and civilians, while logistical teams ensured ammunition, food, and equipment reached forward positions. These efforts allowed the Allied forces to maintain operational momentum and prepare for the next stage of the campaign. Civilians in liberated areas began to return to normalcy. Allied forces assisted in restoring water, electricity, and essential services, while providing security against remaining Japanese holdouts. The Philippines was slowly being restored, marking both a military and humanitarian victory. Allied aircraft continued to patrol Luzon, maintaining air superiority and supporting ground operations. Naval forces in surrounding waters intercepted any Japanese attempts to reinforce or escape. The integrated approach ensured that Luzon would remain firmly in Allied hands. The campaign in Luzon demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations across land, sea, and air. Preparation, intelligence, and combined arms tactics minimized casualties while maximizing operational success. These lessons would guide future campaigns, including the final push toward Japan itself. As night fell, Allied commanders consolidated positions, rotated units, and planned for the next operations in the Philippines. Luzon was secured, Japanese forces were weakened, and the path toward Mindoro, Mindanao, and ultimately the Japanese home islands was clear. With Luzon secured, Allied forces turned their focus to Mindoro and Mindanao, islands critical for controlling the southern Philippines and securing airfields for future operations. These campaigns would extend the liberation, further weaken Japanese forces, and provide strategic bases for the final phases of the Pacific War. Troops, landing craft, and supplies were amassed on Leyte, preparing for the assault on Mindoro. Reconnaissance had mapped beaches, Japanese positions, and potential obstacles. Artillery, naval bombardment, and airstrikes were scheduled to soften enemy defenses before the first wave of troops landed. Preparation was meticulous, ensuring maximum effectiveness. Allied forces landed under heavy observation but faced lighter resistance than on Luzon. Engineers cleared obstacles, infantry secured beachheads, and tanks moved inland to support the advance. By the end of the first day, Mindoro was under Allied control, providing vital airfields to support subsequent operations on Luzon and Mindanao. The success demonstrated lessons learned from previous amphibious assaults. Attention then shifted to Mindanao, the second-largest island in the Philippines, with dense jungles, rugged terrain, and fortified Japanese positions. Planning involved air, sea, and land coordination, ensuring supply lines and reinforcement routes were secured. Allied commanders knew that controlling Mindanao would neutralize remaining Japanese resistance in the southern Philippines. Allied carriers, battleships, and destroyers patrolled Mindanao's coastal waters. Naval gunfire softened enemy positions, while submarines patrolled to intercept Japanese reinforcements. Aircraft conducted reconnaissance, bombing raids, and fighter sweeps, ensuring air superiority for the impending landings. The seas and skies became an extension of the battlefield. The first waves landed on Mindanao's beaches under artillery and aerial cover. Japanese defenders, entrenched in fortified positions, attempted to repel the invasion, but coordinated Allied operations overwhelmed resistance. Troops quickly established beachheads, enabling the rapid deployment of reinforcements, supplies, and artillery support. The island was gradually brought under Allied control. Once ashore, Allied troops advanced through dense jungles, rivers, and mountains. Patrols scouted enemy positions, artillery supported infantry movements, and airstrikes targeted fortified strongpoints. Japanese resistance was localized but fierce, requiring systematic clearing of towns and ridges to ensure security. Engineers constructed and repaired airfields, allowing fighter and bomber support to reach deeper into the southern Philippines. Control of these strategic points ensured supply routes remained open and Allied forces could sustain the campaign across multiple islands. Mindanao became a springboard for operations toward smaller islands and final Japanese positions in the Philippines. Allied forces assisted local populations, restoring infrastructure, providing food, and ensuring safety from remaining Japanese pockets. The liberation of Mindoro and Mindanao not only advanced military objectives but also restored hope and stability to the southern Philippines. By nightfall, Mindoro and Mindanao were secured, Japanese forces were increasingly isolated, and Allied troops fortified positions for the final phase of the Philippine campaign. With the archipelago largely under control, the stage was set for the push toward the remaining Japanese strongholds and the eventual return to Japan itself. By April 1945, Allied forces had largely secured the southern Philippines. Mindoro and Mindanao were under firm control, and remaining Japanese forces were isolated, scattered, and increasingly desperate. The liberation of the southern archipelago represented a critical milestone, ensuring supply lines, airfields, and staging areas for the final campaigns toward the Japanese home islands. Small Japanese units continued to resist, hiding in jungles and fortified villages. Allied patrols systematically located and eliminated these remnants, using intelligence, artillery, and air strikes to minimize casualties. The gradual clearing of these pockets ensured that the southern Philippines would remain secure. Allied forces fortified key positions, including ports, airfields, and major towns. Engineers repaired infrastructure and established defensive positions to prevent any resurgence. Naval patrols and air reconnaissance maintained dominance over surrounding waters and skies, preventing Japanese reinforcements. Airfields constructed on Mindoro and Mindanao allowed for fighter and bomber support across the southern Philippines. Logistics networks ensured continuous supply of ammunition, fuel, and provisions to advancing troops. The operational readiness of Allied forces made the southern Philippines a launching point for further advances toward Japanese-controlled islands and strategic targets. Civilians, liberated from Japanese occupation, began rebuilding their lives. Allied forces coordinated humanitarian efforts, restoring essential services and providing medical care. The liberation of the southern Philippines symbolized both military victory and the restoration of hope for the Filipino people. Remaining Japanese units were cut off from reinforcements and resupply. Morale plummeted, and organized resistance became sporadic. The southern Philippines was effectively secured, marking a turning point in the campaign and further weakening Japan's defensive perimeter. With the southern Philippines secured, Allied commanders turned their attention to consolidating gains, reinforcing positions, and preparing for operations closer to the Japanese home islands. Airfields, ports, and supply depots would support continued advances, ensuring operational momentum. By mid-1945, the Allies had secured the Philippines and moved closer to the Japanese home islands. One of the next critical objectives was Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, but of enormous strategic significance. Its airfields could provide a base for fighter escorts and emergency landing for bombers attacking Japan, making its capture essential for the final phase of the Pacific War. Japanese forces had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress. Thousands of soldiers constructed an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions across the island's volcanic terrain. Every hill, ridge, and lava formation was fortified, creating one of the most difficult defensive positions in the Pacific theater. The island's small size belied the magnitude of its defenses. Allied planners conducted extensive reconnaissance, including aerial photography, submarine patrols, and intercepted communications. Landing zones were carefully selected, and artillery, naval, and air support was synchronized for maximum effectiveness. The operation would require meticulous coordination, precise timing, and overwhelming force to overcome the Japanese defenses. Marines and soldiers trained intensively for amphibious landings under extreme conditions. Exercises included volcanic terrain simulations, obstacle clearing, and combined arms coordination. Engineers prepared equipment and landing craft for rapid deployment under heavy fire. Preparation was the foundation for success in this pivotal operation. Allied naval forces amassed off Iwo Jima, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Heavy bombardments were planned to destroy Japanese fortifications, artillery positions, and supply caches before the landings. Submarines patrolled surrounding waters to intercept any reinforcements or escape attempts. Every element was positioned to ensure overwhelming support for the landing forces. Allied aircraft conducted continuous reconnaissance and bombing raids. Fighters cleared skies of Japanese aircraft, while dive bombers targeted fortifications, tunnels, and artillery positions. Aerial operations softened enemy defenses, reduced casualties, and provided critical intelligence for ground commanders. Air superiority would be decisive in the coming assault. Marines were briefed extensively on the expected intensity of the battle. The combination of volcanic terrain, entrenched defenses, and expected Japanese resistance required mental toughness and discipline. Morale and cohesion would be just as vital as firepower in achieving victory. On Iwo Jima, troops, landing craft, supplies, and artillery were staged in the days leading to the invasion. Every operation, from bombardment to logistics, was rehearsed and synchronized. The capture of Iwo Jima would not only provide strategic airfields but also demonstrate the Allies' capability to conduct amphibious assaults on the most heavily defended islands in the Pacific. February 19, 1945. One of the most iconic and brutal battles of the Pacific War began. American Marines, supported by naval and air bombardment, stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. The island's defenders, entrenched in bunkers, tunnels, and fortified ridges, were prepared to fight to the death. The small island would become a stage for courage, sacrifice, and strategic determination. 4 days before the landing, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded Japanese positions. Aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs, targeting artillery, bunkers, and supply points. Despite the bombardment, Japanese defenses were resilient, with many troops sheltered in deep tunnels impervious to surface attacks. The stage was set for a grueling battle. Landing craft surged forward, carrying Marines into crashing surf and steep volcanic sand. Japanese artillery and machine guns tore into the beach, but Marines pressed forward with determination. Engineers cleared obstacles, while tanks attempted to provide support over difficult terrain. Each yard gained came at a steep cost in lives and resources. Japanese commanders, anticipating the assault, utilized tunnels, caves, and interconnected fortifications. Artillery and mortar positions were hidden behind natural terrain, while snipers and machine gun nests targeted advancing troops. The strategy was to inflict maximum casualties and slow the American advance, turning Iwo Jima into a symbol of resistance. Marines advanced slowly from the beaches, encountering intense fire from well-hidden positions. Flamethrowers, grenades, and coordinated artillery strikes were used to neutralize bunkers. Progress was measured in yards, each a hard-fought victory against a determined enemy. Aircraft continued strafing and bombing runs, targeting known defensive positions. Naval gunfire provided continuous support, breaking through key fortifications and suppressing enemy artillery. The integration of land, air, and sea power was essential to sustaining the assault and minimizing further casualties. The cost was immense. Marines fell, but determination and training kept the units moving forward. Commanders emphasized coordination, mutual support, and relentless pressure to achieve strategic objectives. The sacrifice of each soldier paved the way for future advances inland. By nightfall, Marines had secured initial beachheads, but the island's interior remained heavily contested. Defensive fortifications still posed significant threats, and the battle for Iwo Jima had only just begun. Every foothold gained, however, brought the Allies closer to controlling the island's airfields and strategic positions. After securing the beaches, American forces turned their attention to Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak dominating Iwo Jima. Control of this high ground was essential, as it allowed Japanese forces to observe and fire upon every Allied advance across the island. The battle for Suribachi would become a symbol of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. The Japanese had prepared extensively, with tunnels, bunkers, and hidden machine gun positions across the mountain. Artillery and mortars targeted advancing Marines, while snipers slowed progress at every step. The peak was defended with the same determination that had made Iwo Jima one of the most fortified islands in the Pacific. Marines moved cautiously up the slopes, facing steep volcanic ash and relentless fire. Flamethrowers, grenades, and artillery were used to neutralize bunkers. Communication between squads and support from naval artillery and aircraft proved crucial in overcoming the tenacious defenses. Every inch gained was a testament to training, courage, and coordination. Aircraft bombed fortified positions, while naval gunfire provided continuous suppression of Japanese defenses. The combination of firepower and careful infantry tactics allowed Marines to steadily advance despite the difficult terrain. Coordination between land, sea, and air forces was a decisive factor in the grueling fight for Suribachi. On February 23, 1945, Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. In a moment that would become one of the most iconic images of the war, the American flag was raised, signaling a symbolic victory amidst a brutal campaign. The flag represented not just the mountain's capture but the determination of every soldier fighting across Iwo Jima. While the peak was secured, fierce fighting continued across the island's volcanic terrain. Japanese forces used interconnected tunnels to launch counterattacks, forcing Marines to clear each position systematically. Progress was slow, measured yard by yard, but relentless determination gradually secured the island. Casualties mounted, yet morale remained high. Commanders emphasized teamwork, mutual support, and perseverance, ensuring that every objective, no matter how small, was achieved. The struggle for Suribachi embodied the intensity and human cost of the Pacific War. By nightfall, the summit was secured and Marines consolidated positions around the mountain. Artillery, engineers, and infantry prepared for continued operations inland, as Japanese resistance remained determined in lower sectors. The symbolic victory of Suribachi strengthened resolve and paved the way for the final stages of the battle. With Mount Suribachi secured, the battle for Iwo Jima entered its most grueling phase. Allied forces faced relentless Japanese resistance, entrenched in a vast network of tunnels, caves, and fortified positions across the island. The struggle was brutal, measured not in miles but in yards of territory gained. Japanese defenders used an intricate system of tunnels to launch counterattacks and ambush Allied troops. Marines encountered hidden artillery, machine guns, and booby traps at every turn. Clearing these positions required flamethrowers, demolition charges, and coordinated infantry assaults. Every tunnel captured neutralized a threat and brought the island closer to complete Allied control. Infantry units advanced slowly, supported by tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. Lava fields, volcanic ash, and rugged terrain complicated movement, requiring improvisation and careful coordination. Progress was measured in small increments, with each captured ridge or bunker representing a significant tactical gain. Allied aircraft maintained air superiority, conducting strafing runs, bombing fortified positions, and providing reconnaissance. Naval gunfire targeted known Japanese strongpoints, assisting infantry in neutralizing heavily defended areas. The integration of land, sea, and air power allowed for a steady, though costly, advance across the island. Casualties were high. Medical teams worked tirelessly under fire to evacuate and treat wounded Marines, demonstrating the resilience and organization of Allied forces. Despite losses, determination and discipline allowed units to continue pressing forward against an enemy willing to fight to the last man. Marines methodically cleared strongpoints, capturing ridges, bunkers, and strategic positions that dominated the terrain. Japanese defenses, though fierce, gradually weakened under the sustained assault. Each victory, however small, was vital for maintaining momentum and securing the island. By nightfall, Allied forces had consolidated their gains across central and northern Iwo Jima. Fortifications were strengthened, supplies were replenished, and plans were made for the final push to capture the remaining southern sectors. Victory on Iwo Jima would come at an enormous cost, but it was within reach. By early March 1945, Allied forces had made significant gains across Iwo Jima, but the island was far from fully secured. Japanese defenders, though heavily depleted, continued to resist fiercely in southern sectors and remaining tunnels. The final phase of the battle would demand courage, precision, and relentless coordination. Marines systematically cleared remaining Japanese positions, using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-quarters combat. Hidden tunnels and bunkers required careful tactics to avoid ambushes and minimize casualties. Each cleared stronghold brought the island closer to complete Allied control. Naval bombardments continued to strike remaining defensive positions, while carrier-based aircraft conducted reconnaissance in targeted fortified areas. The integration of air and sea firepower allowed infantry units to advance steadily despite intense enemy resistance. The struggle for Iwo Jima was marked by extraordinary bravery. Marines advanced under constant fire, rescuing comrades, clearing bunkers, and holding positions against counterattacks. Casualties were heavy, and the human cost of the battle underscored the intensity and sacrifice inherent in this campaign. With the island's terrain gradually secured, Allied engineers repaired and cleared airfields. These fields would serve as critical bases for fighter escorts and emergency landings for B-29 bombers attacking Japan. The capture of Iwo Jima, though small in size, provided a strategic foothold for the final stages of the Pacific War. Remaining Japanese forces, isolated and outnumbered, were either neutralized or forced into surrender. By mid-March, the island was fully under Allied control, marking a pivotal victory in the Pacific theater. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations, meticulous planning, and the resilience of Allied troops. Iwo Jima's capture allowed the Allies to establish forward bases for bombing campaigns against Japan, shortening the path to victory in the Pacific. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi symbolized not only tactical success but also the courage and sacrifice of every soldier who fought on the island. With Iwo Jima secured, Allied commanders turned their focus to Okinawa, the next and largest battle of the Pacific War. Lessons learned, troops replenished, and supply lines reinforced, the stage was set for the final push toward Japan itself. April 1, 1945. Allied forces launched the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War on Okinawa, a key island 350 miles from mainland Japan. Control of Okinawa would provide a staging ground for air operations, logistical support, and a potential base for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. The battle would be a decisive, bloody confrontation unlike any other in the Pacific theater. Japanese forces had transformed Okinawa into a fortress, employing a strategy of defense in depth. Caves, bunkers, ridges, and airborne strongpoints were prepared to slow Allied advances. Kamikaze attacks, artillery, and entrenched infantry would challenge every step of the invading forces. The defenders were determined, knowing that Okinawa was a last line before the Japanese mainland. On April 1st, thousands of Marines and soldiers landed on Okinawa's beaches under covering fire from naval bombardments and airstrikes. The Japanese response was immediate, with artillery, machine guns, and kamikaze attacks targeting landing craft and supporting vessels. Troops established beachheads, but progress inland was slow, methodical, and deadly. The skies above Okinawa became a deadly battlefield. Kamikaze pilots crashed planes into Allied ships, inflicting severe damage and casualties. Naval gunners, fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft defenses worked tirelessly to repel the attacks, but the intensity and frequency tested Allied resolve. Allied forces advanced cautiously through rugged terrain, villages, and hills. Japanese defenders used caves, tunnels, and fortified positions to launch ambushes and counterattacks. Every village captured, every ridge secured, was a costly but necessary step toward the island's liberation. Aircraft conducted constant bombing and strafing missions, targeting Japanese fortifications and artillery. Naval vessels bombarded coastal defenses and provided fire support for advancing troops. The combination of land, sea, and air operations was critical to sustaining the assault over Okinawa's challenging terrain. Casualties were staggering, both on land and at sea. Medical teams worked under fire, evacuating the wounded and treating injuries. The battle became a test of endurance, courage, and coordination on an unprecedented scale. Okinawa represented the last major obstacle before a potential invasion of Japan. Its capture would provide airfields, staging areas, and logistical hubs critical to the final phase of the war. The intensity of the battle foreshadowed the challenges the Allies would face in the Japanese home islands. By nightfall, initial objectives were secured, but fighting continued across the island. Every foothold gained required relentless pressure, courage, and coordination. The battle for Okinawa had only just begun, marking a decisive chapter in the Pacific War. The battle for Okinawa had raged for more than 2 months. It was a campaign fought across every inch of volcanic rock, a struggle of men, machines, and endurance. By late May, the Japanese defense was collapsing under relentless pressure. But even in defeat, the defenders refused surrender. They fought on, their commanders embracing death as honor demanded. Okinawa was becoming not only a battlefield, but a warning of what awaited if Japan itself were invaded. The heart of Okinawa stood the Shuri Line, a network of caves, tunnels, and defensive ridges. It was Japan's final fortress on the island, manned by tens of thousands of soldiers. For weeks, American artillery pounded the line with unrelenting fury. Each ridge fell only after bitter fighting, each cave cleared by grenades, flamethrowers, and courage. When the line finally broke, the cost had been staggering. For both sides above Okinawa, the skies were a storm of fire. Thousands of Japanese pilots turned their planes into weapons, kamikaze missions meant to destroy the Allied fleet. Ships burned. Men fought fires with their bare hands. Every attack reminded the Allies that Japan's will to resist was far from broken. In the waters around Okinawa, over 30 Allied ships were sunk and hundreds damaged, the heaviest naval losses since Pearl Harbor. Among the horrors of Okinawa were the civilians, caught between two armies. Tens of thousands fled into caves, terrified, starving, confused. Japanese propaganda had told them that Americans would bring death and cruelty. Many took their own lives rather than face capture. For the Marines and soldiers who found survivors, the scenes were unforgettable. A glimpse into the tragedy of total war. By mid-June, the Japanese army launched its final, desperate counterattacks. Under constant bombardment, exhausted, outnumbered, and surrounded, they charged into the guns. Few returned. When the smoke cleared, organized resistance had ended. General Mitsuru Oshijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide on June 22, 1945. Okinawa was secured. But victory had come at a price beyond imagination. The Allies lost over 12,000 men killed and more than 36,000 wounded. Japan had lost nearly 100,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians. The island was devastated, the seas littered with wreckage, the skies filled with the stench of gunpowder and death. Yet, Okinawa had delivered what the Allies needed, a final launching point. A base within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. Airfields on Okinawa soon hosted American bombers and fighter escorts. From here, raids could reach Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, anywhere in Japan. Okinawa became the anvil upon which the final blows of the Pacific War would be struck. But even as victory drew near, the cost forced new questions. Could the Allies truly invade Japan, at the cost of millions more lives? Or was there another way to end the war? By July 1945, Japan's navy had ceased to exist. Its merchant fleet was destroyed. Cities burned nightly under B-29 firebombing raids. Yet the government refused surrender. In the mountains and schools, children drilled with bamboo spears. Every man, woman, and child was told to prepare for invasion. In secret, on the other side of the world, scientists had created a weapon unlike any before. A bomb that could end the war, or end the world as it was known. It was called the Manhattan Project. As plans for invasion were drawn, President Harry Truman faced an impossible decision: unleash the new weapon, or risk a million more lives in battle. Through July, Allied bombers pounded Japanese cities relentlessly. Warships shelled coastal targets daily. Japan's once mighty imperial navy was gone, its ships resting beneath the Pacific. The empire built on conquest and fear had crumbled. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay flew toward Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb detonated. In seconds, the city ceased to exist. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. The world had entered the nuclear age. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people for the first time in history. He spoke not of victory, but of endurance, of the need to end the unbearable. Japan surrendered. The Pacific War was over. From the burning decks of Pearl Harbor to the shattered islands of Okinawa, one truth had endured: the courage and resolve of those who fought. At Midway, America had struck the first decisive blow. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it had paid the terrible price of final victory. The destruction of Japan's navy, once the most feared in the Pacific, marked the turning of history's tide. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, representatives of Japan signed the instrument of surrender. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur stood as witnesses to the end of the most destructive conflict in human history. The guns fell silent. The seas that had once burned with war were calm again. And out of the ashes of the Pacific, a new world was born. The war in the Pacific claimed over 30 million lives: soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. It reshaped nations, redefined technology, and changed humanity's relationship with power itself. From the coral reefs of Midway to the black sands of Iwo Jima, the story of America's fight against Imperial Japan remains a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to prevail. As the sun sets over the Pacific once more, the ghosts of that era whisper through the waves, reminding us that peace, too, must be guarded with courage.